Hello everyone out there in YouTube land. Welcome to another edition of the Damn Fool Idealistic Crusade live stream, as it were. And hopefully we don't have any technical snafus like last time. For some reason, I guess it's my webcam driver doesn't want to cooperate with Windows 10 or something, so that's why it keeps throwing up random blue screens and such. So hopefully we don't run into any issues as of that this time around, but give it a couple minutes for people to drop in. And before we get into the topic of discussion for tonight, which of course is the 40th anniversary of Apocalypse Now, and the brand new Final Cut release, and the new 4K restoration remaster and UHD release. So anyway, I'm going to give it a couple minutes, let everybody kind of filter in. Looks like we got some folks dropping in. As always, give me a shout. Make sure let me know I'm visible and audible, so I'm not just talking to a brick wall or anything. But yeah, we're talking about Apocalypse Now tonight for the 40th anniversary, and the new restoration is a stunner. So it'll be fun. Give us a lot of good discussion topics. Hey, Melinda, how's it going? Nice to see some familiar faces dropping in. I was just talking to myself to fill in the dead air. Hey, Sega, how's it going, man? Hopefully we don't have any technical problems this time. I think I figured out what it is. Yeah, okay, cool. I'm seen and heard. Awesome. Yeah. I think what it is, I think this Logitech webcam I'm using, it just, I guess some of the drivers don't want to cooperate with Windows 10, and that's what throws up the awful dreaded blue screens. So hopefully we don't have any problems this time, but I guess the only workaround for the time being, if I get one of those, is to just quickly reboot and start a fresh one, because it won't let me rejoin my scheduled stream, because it can't be that easy, can it? Oh, Greg's in the house. Hey, man. Oh gosh, yeah, I could talk about that for like ages. The fact the new 4K release has so many pluses and minuses, and the fact that the it's digipack fold out, but it doesn't have a slipcase. It's like somebody either forgot or they were like, nah, they won't need it. So everybody who gets it in the store, which you really should, because they're so easy to ding up. I found there's an end cap at Walmart finally where I found it, and they had 4 of them, and I had to look through all 4 of them to try and find one that wasn't dinged up so much. I finally just picked one. I'm like, I hope this is it. But yeah, it's very wobbly. Brian's in the house. Hey, man. And 4K. Thanks for dropping in. But yeah, the packaging on the new 4K release is, I mean, it's nice, but yeah, there's a lot of pluses and minuses with this set that we will definitely get into. Oh, Melinda's talking about Pluto has now added the Bond series as like a special channel. They're doing that, and TCM just announced. I think it's actually, I think it's either later this month or in October, but they're doing the entire, or at least the first 19, I think, of the Bond films, which is only the second time they've ever aired any Bond film. I think they aired For Russia with Love once in the past, a couple years ago, and they're doing it as part of a tribute to United Artists, which, I mean, I'm glad they're doing that, because UA is just criminally unknown these days. I mean, the real UA, not whatever moniker they pop up as, because somebody decided to buy the rights. But yeah, so TCM will be doing Dr. No through, I think, through The World Is Not Enough in sequential order. So even though we know all the films by heart now, it'll be really weird and awesome at the same time to see, you know, the TCM hosts come out and actually be talking about the Bond films, which they never have outside of the one time they showed For Russia with Love, which I think was like in 2009 or something, and I didn't hear about it until afterwards, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I miss Bob Osborne talking about Terrence Young for like 10 seconds. How can I live with myself? You know? Yeah, we need we need Pete, Metro, and Rod to pop in. Yeah. Yeah, Gary, I think well, TCM's kind of weird because they, even when there's new remasters, they still generally used standard def masters. I've noticed they have a really good up conversion algorithm, So that's why some people are like, why does the TCM broadcast look better than my DVD copy of such and such random classic Hollywood obscure title? But it's because they have a really good professional algorithm for upscaling. But like if you look, still to this day, it's very rare that they do run things that are from HD masters. It took them a long while, like to switch over for Casablanca and North by Northwest and like some of the big ones. But I just noticed today because it was on, they were running Valley of Gwangi, and I know Warner Archive did that on Blu-ray, but the version they were showing was just the DVD upscaled. And you know, when you upscale a DVD and then you have cable compression, all that stuff. Because I usually just leave TCM on in the background because I'm a giant nerd. Uh, and I turn and I look, and I'm like, oh, it's Valley of Gwangi. I'm like, yeah, Warner Archive put that out on Blu-ray, but this looks like a DVD. I bet they're just upscaling it. So there's no telling, but I would presume they would use whatever the new 4K master is that's turned up on streaming sites and stuff, because it's not in their normal library, so they'll probably just go and use whatever the newest source is. So hopefully that means original audio will be used, but you know, still, it's just cool that TCM is actually going to do them. Like, I can't wait to hear Ben Mankiewicz walk out and talk for 30 seconds. And I'm really excited to see what they say about the later films, because everybody craps on them, but like I could see it now. Coming up this evening on Turner Classic Movies, Roger Moore in his swan song atop the Golden Gate Bridge is James Bond in A View to a Kill, you know, and then they have to come out and instead of, I'll be like, oh gosh, they could be talking about like a Lubitsch classic, and then up next, you know, Roger Moore and the Man with the Golden Gun, and it'd be like, yes, my film nerd heart is finally happy, everything's united, and everybody else is like, what is going on? And I'm like, don't wait, you'll be indoctrinated pretty quick. Uh, so, oh, pizza in the house. Hey, man. Uh, no smells better than napalm, except for perhaps the barbecue smell. Yeah, that's probably, well, you know, they were, you know, cooking steaks out on the beach beforehand, so you know, maybe they did have a Kilgore's barbecue or something. Um, yeah, I couldn't resist, you know, doing this because it's the anniversary and the new release came out, and the price point is so ridiculously low. It's like I had to just pick it up and delve right back in and see what the new transfer was all about. So yeah, and as 4K points out, they did do this new Atmos mix, and it is extraordinarily faithful. I did as much demoing of all the different discs as I could, and the mixes, and then all my old discs and stuff. But unfortunately, doing a week-to-week live stream does not give you much time for critical analysis like I like to do, but that's just my usual nerdy self. So I'm sitting there and like playing the opening like over and over and over again between different versions. But just trying to do all of that week to week in between normal work and normal life and such doesn't give you much time to do that. So yes, as Melinda asked, I do have a couple pickups, not many, but some pretty good stuff. Starting off, some LPs, because of course I can't go near a record store and not come away with something. So this one was an oddity. I didn't even know it existed. So when Peter Gabriel made his landmark So album in 1986, they did all of the singles as 12 inches, and as a rarity, most of the US ones are actually at 45 speed. And I've picked up some of those, but the problem with So has always been, in most people in audiophile circles would know this, as good as the album sounds on vinyl, the original cutting is very heavy on the sibilance. So every time there's an S or a P, but especially the S's, you hear just this massive hissing sound, no matter how good your setup is. So usually one of the torture tracks for testing sibilance performance on a vinyl setup is track 1 of So, Red Rain, because the first line, Red Rain is coming down, that is so huge if your stylus is not good for sibilance. So anyway, so I was flipping through, I always like to look at the single bins, and then I found this one, and I'm like, well, this is kind of different because it's got a blank cover, but it's So single. So this is a 12-inch promo single of Big Time with the same style and artwork as the others, and the, of course, Peter's credit in this little box here was very sparse because this is actually a US promo copy. So it's just the song on two sides, but it's cut not at 45, but at 33. But that being said, the groove space used is extremely wide. So as you can see, almost the entire side is taken up by the song. And the more space you can have for any song, the better your bass response. And it does tame some of the sibilance that's in the standard LP, which otherwise is great. So because they had a sale and this was like $1, I was like, well, this is going home with me. So, I mean, you know, it's only one song, but at least it improves on some of the siblings because it's a great album. Now, next up, this one is a band I've wanted to listen to for a long time. I've heard some of their songs, and of course, I became introduced to them via the Pedigree. This was Mitch Easter's band. Mitch Easter was a pretty well-known producer in the well throughout the '80s, but he's most well known for producing the early REM albums, the Chronic Town EP, and then the first two albums, Murmur and Reckoning, with Don Dixon. But he started a band together, put a band together, a trio called Let's Active, and they only had, I think they have a total of 3 albums. I think the first album was an EP. Then there were like 3 actual albums. So this is the first and the most famous one, and I've wanted to find this for years, but these are not super common. So this is their first full-length album called Cypress, and it still has the original hype sticker on it. Of course, it's on the IRS label, just like all of the early REM albums. And this was mastered by Ted Jensen at Sterling Sound. Sounds phenomenal and is in perfect shape. And as you can see, still has the promotional stamp on it. I think what happened at the local shop is there was either an ex-DJ or a DJ turned collector who turned in a lot of his stuff, because a lot of these are in almost unplayed shape that were in there. So that's a really good band if you like the style of early REM albums and the sort of Athens music scene, and then early '80s alternative, sort of on more of the, of course, on the indie vibe because it's on IRS. And then this one was something I wanted to pick up for a long time. It's not the best sound quality in the source, so I don't know if there's a particular pressing to look for. But this one was super clean, and it was also really interesting because this is got the British label information, but it's an American pressing, which I thought was really strange. But it was so clean and super cheap that I just was like, I'm not going to find this again. So this is the original US pressing of Genesis Live album from 1974. And again, the really interesting thing is this is, for all intents and purposes, it looks exactly like a British pressing because it has the Charisma label indicator up here, and it's distributed by Buddha Records down here. But it's actually apparently the original US pressing. Most all of Genesis' early stuff was available on the Charisma label in the UK, and those are generally regarded to be better in terms of cutting, sound quality, vinyl cleanness, etc. But the US masterings can be really good. So there are some where there are like US copies of certain albums that are really, really well regarded. But this was super clean. It was cut by Sam Feldman at Bell Sound, who was a really good, pretty well regarded engineer still to this day. But as I said, it's on the UK Mad Hatter Charisma label. But on the bottom, it indicates that it is a US pressing. So I found that really, really strange because I was like, wow, this looks like a UK Genesis album. And I've kind of trained myself anytime I see one I don't have, and if it's got this label, I pick it up if it's not too expensive. But yeah, this is an American copy. So that was just really strange to come across. But I've meant to pick this up. I've got most of the early British Genesis albums. I've just picked them up one at a time over the years because I've been trying to get more and more into their early years with Peter Gabriel still on lead vocals, because there are great tracks in there. Even though I'm not really a big prog guy, I really appreciate even the early Genesis. And then last for music, this one was just, I think they're an underrated band, and it was super cheap and super clean. So I picked up the Flock of Seagulls album, Dream Come True, which is one of their later albums. Their main original self-titled album is, you know, an 80s new wave classic and looks and sounds great. This is also like that one on Arista via the Jive label, but pretty good sound quality on this too, and it was super cheap and looks like it's never been played. So, but they are quite underrated. Everybody just talks about the hair, nothing else. And then on for the only other thing, I did pick up one Blu-ray. This, of course, was originally a Criterion title for the longest time, and it was one of the titles, along with The Third Man and some others, that they lost to Studio Canal due to licensing rights. But Criterion never did it on Blu-ray, but Studio Canal did, and nowadays this goes for about $30. There's a digibook version over in Europe, but seeing as this turned up in the local store and they had a sale for Labor Day, I was like, yeah, I can live with that. So I picked up the Studio Canal edition of Grand Illusion, which again is the same disc as the British version, and it's from a 4K remaster, and it has some nice extras with lossless audio and English subtitles, of course. But it's pretty plain and simple, just a, you know, the artwork's pretty nice, but there's no booklet or anything. So if you want fancier packaging, you can track down the digibook in Europe. But like I said, this retails now for about $30 on Amazon. I think it's $29.99 or something. So I picked this up for about less than $6. So I was like, yeah, I can live without the digibook for that price. But of course, Grand Illusion is one of the great. I mean, I hate to call it a war film because it's technically, you know, it's a war film. It's an anti-war film, and in a lot of ways, it is reminiscent of Apocalypse Now in being a film about war that is ultimately against the entire concept of conflict and war. So I was like, wow, I've had Apocalypse on the brain. So this is kind of fortuitous that I picked this up at the same time. But I would like to get the Criterion DVD to have the Criterion extras, and I do like the Criterion cover a little better. It's the same central image, but you know, I have to say this is a pretty decent Blu-ray that Studio Canal did, even though it doesn't have, you know, the intensive efforts that Criterion would have put into it. But I don't know if anybody else is going to license this anytime soon. So that's it for pickups. Outside of course, we're going to talk about Apocalypse, which is what got me started on this topic this week. Let's see. Belfast Child by Simple Minds is a great way to show off your LP collection too. Yeah, I don't have any good Simple Minds yet, but I've been trying to keep an eye out for some clean issues. I know some of theirs. Seems like there are a number of bands from that time period that tried to excel in sound. Simple Minds would be one. Talk Talk would be another. And then like even certain Cure recordings, like there's and they're all slightly different flavors and styles and stuff, but it's like, you know, you want to have the best system possible to really dig into those. So yeah, I always try to keep an eye out for some certain bands, and the only trouble is usually when I find them, it's too expensive, or the vinyl surface itself is not very clean, shall we say. Yeah, the Flock of Seagulls self-titled is fantastic. Yeah, Space Age Love Song is super underrated. Oh yeah, Steely Dan especially. Yes. I have let's see. I did finally pick up Can't Buy a Thrill, which actually sounds pretty good on the actually really good on the original pressing, but the one that sounds amazing is Gaucho. That one sounds phenomenal. I know it's a bit stylistically different, so a lot of people don't like it as much, but it's early. I think it's about from the mid 80s, and it was mastered by Bob Ludwig, and it's one of the most sublime sounding pieces of vinyl you can ever pick up. And I got mine for cheap, and usually on like music forums and stuff, copies of that will go for, you know, 20, $30 at least, even though it's, you know, supposedly a common record. It's phenomenal, but all their stuff is just like, wow. I would like to get their greatest hits LP set, because Bob Louie mastered that one. A lot of people say that the cuts on there sound better than the original album release for each particular song, but I haven't found a clean one yet. So usually when I find one, it's like got a high price tag on it, and then I look at one side and it looks great, and then I look at the other three and they're trash. I'm like, doggone it. It's hard enough finding a regular album that's clean and not overpriced, but a double album just makes it, you know, 4 sides is hard. Oh, talking about, let's see, talking about the usage of the end. Yeah, it really is fantastic, and it's also great because it doesn't. It's fully intrinsic to the film, and everybody puts the, you know, thinks of the song and the film at the same time, but you're still able to listen to the song for its own merits and watch the film for its own merits. It's not just hitting you over the head. It's so iconic. I don't know if there is. It's probably, you know, Born to Be Wild and Easy Rider and a couple tracks in there, and The End and Apocalypse Now. And there's a couple others where it's such iconic usage of you know, actual rock songs, you know, because usually it's just like the most cheesy and generic usage that just makes you want to beat your head against the wall. But what is really cool is they did talk about one of the temp versions they did, and they scored it entirely to Doors songs, and they were like, this works, but we don't know if we should keep it this way the whole time. Like it worked too well, is what they said. So Walter Murch and everybody was like, well, maybe we should dial it back some. So, but I would be really interested to see, like, you know, the 5.5 hour assembly version, you know, where it's like the boat's going upriver and it's a close up of Willard, and all of a sudden it starts playing Can't See Your Face in My Mind, and I'd be like, wow, because I could just picture that as being right there. And of course, the reason why I thought of the Doors in the first place is the Doors were one of, if not the most listened to band over in Vietnam. It's because I guess people picked up on the, I hate to use, you know, the trippy aspects, but definitely the psychedelic aspect intrinsic in, especially in the first 2 albums, would have just probably tied into the madness that went on over there. But you know, that was like a perfect inadvertent. It was an inadvertent perfect method for referencing just the insanity and the primalism and all this stuff that was going on over there, which of course basically became the entire backbone of Apocalypse Now. So that's yeah, it doesn't get much better than that. But about the original Blu-ray, yes, actually, I did have some issues with it. And I guess since we're done with pickups, I'll just get into the technical stuff. Before I get into that, I guess I should get into that first, because otherwise I'll get bogged down in the video history. So the what I didn't like about the original Blu-ray, which this is the 3-disc full disclosure version with all the extras, they did do a new transfer. And this was the first time on video the entire 235 scope presentation was intact, because Vittorio Storaro, for some reason, preferred the 2-to-1 ratio on all the old transfers. So if you watch the original DVDs, if you watch the Laserdisc, if you watch the widescreen VHS, if you're really a glutton for punishment, and you'll notice it's in this weird 2-to-1 ratio. So a lot of the sides are chopped off. It's almost close to a 1:8:5 in a lot of ways. So that was the best part about this release. What I didn't like is there's some DNR going on, so there's some grain reduction that I was not fond of, but the color grading was very strange. I mean, it's fine, it's perfectly watchable, it's still a solid Blu-ray disc, but the combination of the DNR and the color grading being especially kind of weird in certain places, I thought, that really kind of turned me off of this. And since I got this, I've watched it all the way through and all the extras at least once. But I was so kind of bummed about the transfer, I didn't really rewatch it all that much. But that being said, you know, it's still solid, and it did have the original sound design in lossless 5.1 audio, DTS HD master audio. And it does give you both the theatrical version and Redux. And it did have some nice new exclusive extras, including all the ones that were ported over. So, and it's still got great packaging. So I'll talk about that in a second. But I wanted to start the video history with where I started, which is kind of funny because so the way I first actually saw the film, and this is how you should not see the film first, um, but of course, I think most of us probably saw this film this way first if we didn't see the original theatrical release, because of course I was unfortunately not present in 1979 as much as I would have liked to have been. So I first saw this film on the, I believe this is from, yeah, it's from 92, but it's the same transfer as the 91 Walter Murch supervised Laserdisc. But I first saw Apocalypse Now on the Paramount VHS tape. So I saw this film in all its pan and scanned glory, actually. Of course, here you have the stunning original Bob Peak poster artwork, which I think is without a doubt one of the greatest movie posters of all time. I mean, I fell in love with this image when I first saw it somewhere, and I was determined to see this film, even though no store would rent it to me because it was rated R. And I had finally seen all three Godfathers, and so I was trying to dig more into the realm of Coppola. So this was the next logical step. And luckily, I found this slightly weathered but still perfectly serviceable copy. Of course, I was only then kind of discovering the difference between widescreen and pan and scan. As you can see, they actually included a widescreen image on the back cover. And then here, a very nice pan and scan version, so you can see what you're missing, right? Um, but I picked this up. It must have been about 99, 2000 or so. So I saw this film when I was about 10. But I immediately, from the opening, fell into its hypnotic spell, and I basically sat there in a trance for 2.5 hours, and it was over, and I didn't even realize it was over. I had the same experience watching Blade Runner for the first time, also on the same old CRT, also on VHS tape. But anyway, what's interesting about this film, and especially because of all the years it was in the 2-to-1 ratio, if you look at the photography design, it's very center focused. So in a strange way, the panning and scanning, and it was very carefully done. There's not a lot of actual panning. It's individually framed, but somebody actually made this transfer, especially it seems. The pan and scan image, seeing this film in 133, it still actually works in a strange way. And again, I think that's because Storaro's photography is there's a central image in almost every shot that everything kind of builds out from. So, and in a lot of ways, everything still works in 133. But anyway, I just wanted to show you where I first got into the film, which is, again, not the way you technically should, but this is what we had back in the day. So then, moving on to the Laserdisc front, again, this is where that VHS master was made from. So this is the 1991 Laserdisc that was mastered from the 35mm interpositive and the original EK negative under the supervision of Vittorio Storaro himself, who maintained the 2.1 ratio. So this is where the 2.1 ratio first reared its head. But the soundtrack was mastered by Walter Murch, and this was the first time the 70mm audio track was brought into the homes. So that is on this original Paramount release. Also using the phenomenal, incredible Bob Peak artwork and the typical Paramount widescreen jacket, which I still really love the simplicity of these Paramount jackets, the black bars being used for widescreen. And if they ever brought this back, I would be so happy. You get a pretty nice gatefold. The typical usage of stills that Paramount would do, but then you get this nice little letter. Well, it's more of a postcard, but it's actually written by Coppola himself and signed, dated 1991. But the sound of this disc was the first time you could hear the original 70mm track outside of the 70mm release. And Murch specifically mixed it through a ProLogic encoder, so then that way you could get as close as you could in home theaters at the time, which of course were all ProLogic Matrix, and there was no discrete home theater equipment available at the time. So again, this was the first time you could really try and recreate the original 70mm presentation. And you do get this really nice bit of liner notes. All of this gets replicated on the next pressing, right down to the Coppola note. But what's interesting to know is that for all people talk about this film being the first film with split surrounds, which it was the first film released with split surrounds. It wasn't the first with split surrounds. That was actually Superman. They did a test mix for the 70mm version and did a split surround mix, and then chickened out on using it because they thought people would freak out. So, but on the 35mm release, apparently, for all intents and purposes, it was actually shipped out as stereo because they were so afraid, or at least Murch was so afraid, and he was right, that the decoders at the time they were using were not as good technically as what was developed later. And a lot of theaters didn't have their speakers set up right. So he was afraid that the stereo and the surround would get panned all over the place and it would go out of phase and stuff, which it actually would have. So he actually mixed it in essentially plain stereo for the 35mm release. And then if your theater had surround decoding, it would just naturally pull out some occasional things to give some like ambiance. Same thing that happens when you play a mono or stereo movie and you simply turn on ProLogic 2 or 2X or whatever you have that's a matrix system, and it basically just kind of spreads out some of the ambiance and pulls out the occasional effect or two. But that's what the 35mm release was. And then I know somebody mentioned the different ending, but what happened was when they put out the first 35mm prints, they had to put regular credits on because the 70mm version just ended on a black screen. And everybody had the printed book of credits and the souvenir program they were given at the beginning, and they just walk out with the program, and then they'd have the credits. But on the regular general release for 35mm, you couldn't do that. It wasn't feasible to print thousands and thousands and thousands and ship them from everywhere to Kansas to New York to Florida. So they had to put a credit sequence on. So they had the footage of them destroying the Kurtz compound set because part of the agreement to even build it was that it had to be destroyed. So the thought was, well, let's just blow it to hell and we'll put a bunch of cameras on it. And that way, if we ever need it, we've got it. So you see a little bit of that in the very opening where Walter Murch and others edited in little glimpses of the very end. That's where the fires through the trees and the actual bits and bobs that are flying around come from. But they took that footage and made about a 6-minute compilation of it and put the credits over it. So when people first saw the regular version in 35, they saw that ending and were under the impression that they had called in the airstrike and thus changed the meaning of the movie. When that wasn't the intention at all. So that was recalled, and then they just reissued the regular prints with just a regular black screen with regular white credits. And that's actually what is on the Laserdisc and the VHS tape, and I think the first couple DVDs too. So that's what caused that confusion. But what's really cool on the Blu-rays and then the new 4K release, they include that, and they actually scanned it in HD. But it's got Coppola kind of talks a commentary over it, so you can't just watch it. But it's really cool that they actually upgraded that to HD. So I guess if you really wanted to, you could mute it or something. But you can actually see that footage with the credits over it, and it's just really spellbinding to look at. But again, it really does kind of alter the meaning of the end of the film. And when you look at the modern versions, they literally just fade in out of black, and then they fade into black at the very end. There's no credits at all. So it perfectly replicates the original release. There isn't even the plain white credits on black later. But so yeah, that's how I got started on Apocalypse, and that's how the sound went. So then moving on, after they made the VHS and sold bukus of both, they were doing their remaster series later on in Laserdisc. This one is from 1997. So titles like Hunt for Red October, Patriot Games, everything that got a remaster with basically AC3 added. That basically would spiff up the old transfer a bit, so it's usually a bit sharper, a bit less aliasing. The colors maybe a tiny bit better. It's just, you know, like anything that got pressed like 5 years after in the Laserdisc realm. But then they would add an AC3 track. So a natural choice would be Apocalypse Now. And like the others, they use the whole jacket for the cover artwork, so it's stunning and easily frameable. Definitely a much cheaper version to try and own original poster artwork, because this is one of those posters I'd love to own an original of, but I just can't afford it. And as you can see, it has the Paramount remastered digital surround sound across the top, indicating that this is indeed a remastered new version. So that's how you tell them apart if you're looking for one. Now, the gatefold is a lot more, you know, fancy. As you can see, it has the exact same little letter from Coppola there. Has pretty much mostly the same. I think the chapter breaks and the side breaks are pretty close as well. One thing this also does not have is the original disc. When it started and ended sides, it did a fade to black. So it would fade out at the end of side one and fade in at the beginning of side two and fade out at the end of side two and so on. But this one just goes like a regular Laserdisc. You do get some nice text on the inside, but the rear text is the same as the original disc. It's almost exactly the same layout, actually, outside of the background color. But the only difference here is you see the THX stamp is actually here, whereas on the old disc, it apparently was about the first THX mastered disc, but it wasn't credited as such. And then you see the Dolby Digital moniker. And to tell you the additional blurb they added, so they say the same thing. This Laserdisc was mastered from the 35 Enter positive and original EK negative under Storaro's supervision, and the digital stereo soundtrack was remixed by Walter Murch at Skywalker Sound. And then underneath that, it says, it's literally just tacked on, the AC3 soundtrack was remixed by Walter Murch at the Salzens Film Center. So basically, this transfer is actually quite a bit. I mean, the original disc is surprisingly good to this day, but it's got a little bit of aliasing here and there, and some of the color in certain shots could be better, but on the whole, it's amazing for a 1991 disc. So this being a 97 disc, it's a lot cleaner, it's a bit sharper, there's less aliasing, but the big draw, of course, is going to be the AC3 track, which is really good. And you're able to finally hear the surrounds in stereo instead of just mono trying to be as stereo as possible. The only thing I will notice, I'm sorry, the only thing I noticed is that it's mainly the voiceover dialogue, especially when it's by itself, because this film will frequently collapse almost down to mono for dialogue and the voiceover and things. But sometimes it feels like the voiceover is kind of at a distance. So if you play back certain scenes across all these different copies, because you're crazy that way, you'll notice that on this AC3 track, it seems like the voiceover track is mixed a bit farther away is like the best I could put it. It's in the center channel, of course, like it always was, but it feels like it's a bit more forward from your listening position, whereas it's iconically recorded to be like almost like directly at you, so much just so that it just like diffuses into your brain. But that could be my demodulator, because I have the old Sony E800 demodulator, and I have all the settings turned off, but my display burned out. So I don't know if it's just that particular demodulator being weird, but I did notice that on a couple scenes on this particular release. But on the whole, this is better than the 91 disc, but you know, they were still able to make further improvements. So a couple years later, I think they did the first DVD in 1999, which is this Laserdisc on a DVD disc. It's exactly the same. I rented it like a bajillion times, and I never got to buy it because it suddenly went out of print because they were preparing Redux, and Redux came out, and Redux had a big theatrical release with a new 5.1 mix based on the original, And it was all printed on Technicolor dye transfer prints because it was during the period of Technicolor trying to bring back the dye transfer process. So it resulted in really colorful prints that were, technically robust and amazing because it was being made in 2001 versus 1979, and you could see it at your local multiplex. I unfortunately did not get to see it, but I remember walking through the theater when it was playing and hearing the sound booming out, and seeing the sign. That by that point they had switched over to the little LED signs, with the little dots showing the title and the time, and you could see Apocalypse Now Redux reading across the top. But honestly, I never liked the idea of Redux, and I still to this day really kind of hate it. I don't like all of the additional scenes they put in, but I do like watching them on their own. Um, I am glad they shot all this stuff, and I would like to see the super long version. I'd like for them to just put out a Blu-ray disc in the newest box set that's just literally every other scene we shot. You watch them at your will, so, on its own, I like the idea of things like the French plantation sequence, but I think the magic of the film is in the editing of the original 1979 theatrical version. I like individual pieces, like I said, but if you throw all of them in there, it really kind of deviates from the main story drive in a lot of ways. But again, some people love it. And then this new final cut, it's like trying to play devil's advocate. It's like a balance between the two. So it drops about, I think it's just over 3 hours. So it drops like 20 minutes or so from Redux, because Redux is about 3.5 hours. But it does keep the plantation scene, and it keeps a couple other things. And I'm kind of like, well, I mean, it's better, but I'm like, if I'm going to watch this, I'd go ahead and just watch Redux, because then I'd be going, well, where's that scene? And where's stealing Kilgore's surfboard? And where's all this other stuff? But again, I guess it's a better attempt, but still, I wish they would just release the whole work print version, or just, again, every scene so you could watch them one at a time, because there are times where I would like to, because I'll rewatch the theatrical version, but I'll be like, you know what? I'd like to watch the plantation scene again. And then I have to go to Redux, and I have to fast forward all the way through, and then find it, play it, and then stop, and then go, where are the other scenes? And then just like look up online and try to find timestamps. But anyway, so when Redux came out on DVD, they managed to actually fit the whole thing on a single disc, which is kind of crazy. But neither of those really had extras outside. I think Redux had the commentary. So fast forward a couple years, and in 2006, they decided to do a full-on special edition, which Paramount released as, and this is probably still the best packaging for the film, even though when I first got it, I found it really annoying because I didn't know how you're supposed to work it. But this is the complete Dossier DVD. Again, this was released in 2006 and was the first full-on special edition. It basically, I don't know if they did a full-on, they didn't really do a full-on restoration overhaul, but they did a brand new DVD encoding. So the bitrate is pretty much maxed out on this. A whole bunch of extra features are included, really nice artwork, and of course the box itself mimics the confidential dossier packet that Willard opens on the PT boat to find out about Kurtz. So you actually open it at the wax seal area, and then you get this really nice digipack fold out with the classic image of Kurtz and the water overhead, and then the title is actually embossed there, and it's very, very glossy, so I don't know how well you can see that. But again, this is one of the really nice DVD packages. Again, this is where all of these special features really were made. And then all of these have been carried over. So if you look at the Blu-rays and then the new 4K release, the vast majority of the supplements are from this DVD release. So it's really handy to have the original DVD case. You can read the description and remember which is which. And also, because these are all standard def, when you watch them on Blu-ray and such, you get the stair-stepping effect and stuff. So most of the time I just give up, pop it out, and just put the DVD disc in and watch the old features on the DVD. But the most notable thing, and what was really annoying at the time, because they maxed out the bitrate and everything, and because they're seamlessly branching the theatrical and Redux, they had to split it onto 2 discs. So I think they break in the same place. But right after at the conclusion of the sampan scene, where the sampan boat full of just a regular family are massacred, you fade to black, and then a little text screen pops up that says, "Please insert disc 2." You have to insert disc 2, wait for the intros, hit play movie, then hit play movie again on the main menu. Then, do you want to do the theatrical? Do you want to do Redux? Where are you picking up from? So it's not like a Laserdisc where you just swap out a disc. But at the time, I was about 15 or so, and I'm like, this is horrible. Like, I'm gonna sit there and swap discs and then hit the menu button like 5 times in a row. But for what they were trying to do, and the technology of the time, it is extremely, extremely still a good DVD release. And then there's the reverse art. Let me show you the rest of the interior, so I can give you the full width. Again, in a lot of ways, this actually has more thought put into it than even the 4K release packaging, which we'll get to in a second. And I do love the fact that the quote they decided to use was, "Never get out of the boat. Absolutely goddamn right. Unless you were going all the way." Just really fits. And every time you open this to rewatch the film, you'd see that and you'd be like, yep, it's apocalypse time. But anyway, what was also really interesting is they had a store exclusive of this for a while. At Circuit City, you could get it, and it had a third disc that had, basically, it was just tucked in here. And the bonus was being able to watch the compound being blown up. But of course, I searched every store as a teenager because I was like, do you have the Apocalypse Now complete dossier with bonus disc? No, dang it. And I'd go dig through the shelves, and then if we were ever near another Circuit City, I would go in and ask, because of course this was still, we had a computer at the time, and I occasionally would get online, but I wasn't really cognizant with there were store inventory searches on their websites, but they were not like they are today. So it was still a game of calling individual stores, and I was just trying to find this bonus disc because I wanted to see the destruction footage. But I never found it, so I just got the regular one. And then later on, I found that they just literally shoved a disc in a little paper sleeve in this. But if you ever find one of these with a third disc flopping around, that's what it is. So then go back to this for a minute. So I think this was 2010, I want to say. Let me make sure. 2010. So 2010, the Zoetrope was now partnered with Lionsgate, so all of these were no longer being done by Paramount, which is good in that Lionsgate is easily distributable, usually on the cheaper side and stuff, but also bad because Lionsgate is cheap. So the full disclosure comes out, and you could get it very cheaply, just the Blu-ray disc for the movie itself, and it used the original Bob Peak artwork. But the full disclosure version, which very neatly has Kurtz reflected in the PT boat. So again, I do like the packaging on here, and they actually give you a really nice slip box, which they did not on the 4K because Lionsgate is super cheap. And here on the rear, you get the boatmen of the compound, and this really nice booklet, which is really well illustrated. It's very sturdy, and the printing and everything is really nice. Basically, it's the quality level of what you'd get in a digibook, but it's nice that it's a separate booklet because you can actually flip through it pretty easily. So again, the main draw of this was the first time you could ever see the film in scope properly, because I don't know who did it, but somebody finally said, hey, Vittorio, we're tired of this 2:1 crap. Like, we're just going to put it out in 2:3:5. So that's the greatest part of this release. That was what was really important. So the digipack And here, when folded out, the back gives you a really nice artist rendering of the cavalry attack. And then here you get the listing of all of the extras. So again, the theatrical and Redux are seamlessly branched on disc 1. And then you have the commentary, which is actually the same. So basically just listen to the Redux commentary to get the whole thing. And then if you watch the commentary for the theatrical, it's basically about, it's the same exact track. It just is actually shorter. They just make little edits and stuff. And then disc 2 has the bulk of the extras, most of which are all the standard def extras pulled from the complete Dossier set. The new extras, there's an hour-long interview with John Milius and an hour-long interview with Martin Sheen, and both of those are extraordinarily good, very revealing, and it was cool that they actually made new extras. And then disc 3 was the HD premiere of the Hearts of Darkness, Filmmakers Apocalypse documentary, which was from 1991, which was made from the diary and then the video footage that was recorded by Coppola's wife, Eleanor, on the set. The idea being that she could make this stuff for a promo film or to help United Artists sell the film, and she was also keeping her diaries. But basically, it became her documenting how everyone slowly but surely was losing their minds. And again, all this stuff has been ported over to the next release, but show you the tray here. The disc art is really nice, and then the back shows the napalm strike, so it's a really, really nice little digipack. Now, again, my problem with this was that, as great as it was, having everything finally in scope, there is some DNR, and the color timing, especially in certain sections, is just really kind of weird. This film has some very intensive color in certain spots, but it's also naturalistic. It's a very, very hard film to master for home video, no matter what your format. So I was really impressed with how well they did on the original Laserdisc, and of course the VHS, and then the first DVD. And then when Redux came out, they had the dye transfer Technicolor prints, which caused the color to come across as a bit different in certain spots. So I mean, this is still a solid Blu-ray. I don't want to besmirch it too much, but also I'm just not happy with it. And but on the audio side, things are a lot better because they basically went back to the well once more and remastered the original audio for HD presentation. So on here, you get a 24-bit DTS HDMA track. And when you look at the Redux audio, it's not really a complete remix. They basically were able to bring the 79 track into the modern realm without changing anything. But when you get to the Redux scenes, you can tell it's a new scene because sonically it's a bit different. It's not as polished. It's a bit rougher, especially in scenes like when there's an extra bit where Kilgore's walking on the beach after I think it's when they're talking about surfing, where he gives Lance the oh shoot, what is it? The emblem of the cavalry. And then it starts in the original footage, it goes to that Redux scene, then it goes back to the original footage. And if you listen to that part of the mix, you can tell there's a space where it changes. So I'm actually very happy with the HD audio presentation on here, and this carried over to the UHD and new Blu-ray. So again, audio-wise, I'm happy with this. Packaging, everything. It's just the transfer is not the greatest. So that brings us on to the new fellow on the block. And again, it's going to be hard to hold because the packaging is a bit goofy. So this is the new 4K UHD release of it's titled as the Final Cut, but it includes that new cut and the other two versions. So you get all three versions of the film in here. But packaging wise, as we were talking about earlier, you pick this up and you take off the UHD tray and you have a digipack. There is no slip box. This is literally what you get on the shelf, and this one was the best one I could find. I don't know if you can see, there's not really any indents, but there's a couple little places where it could easily get crumpled because, as you can see, it's literally just a digipack sitting on the shelf in shrink wrap. So if you're really interested in this release and you want to get one that does not have a bunch of dings, basically just go to your local store, try and find it somewhere, and do like I did and literally pull all the copies off the shelf. I was standing in Walmart with 4 of these in my hand, and I'm like looking at each one, and I'm like trying to see because it sounded like some had loose discs and stuff. But I mean, the packaging is pretty nice. It just needed a slip box, if they were going to do this. Now the front cover, this is actually the commissioned art for Mondo did a poster, and I guess they struck a deal. So this is actually the new limited edition Mondo artwork. And when I first saw it, online, it looked a little cartoony, but when you actually see it in your hand, it's a lot better. There's a metallic sheen given to it. Sheen, no pun intended. But that carries over to the rest of the art, which when folded out, gives you a shot of the Kurtz compound. And, I mean, it does look really nice. And of course, all of the red, makes you immediately think of blood due to the shade they picked. So I can see what they were going for. But again, this needed a slit box. Because, I mean, the full disclosure Blu-ray had a slit box. This needed a slit box. But hey, Lionsgate is cheap. Now, you open the digipack like this. And as you can see, the spines are just blank. So that's another cheapy move. And then another cheapy move, the new Final Cut discs have art on them, and then all the other discs do not, including the other 4K discs. So you'll have to keep that in mind when you're going through discs. Now, I think the artwork is the same on all 3 panels. Let me pop out some of these so I can show you really fast. Only problem with some of these disc hubs is they're just a little darn annoying sometimes. There we go. It's the stack type of hub, so you got to do one at a time and then try and pop them out. But basically, it's the same image you get on the menu, which is, again, sort of a cartoonish or stylized image of the guys on the PT boat. So that does run across, and it does look nice enough. But anyhow, so here is the 4K disc for the new Final Cut, which is encoded by itself on both 4K and Blu-ray. And then the 4K disc of the theatrical and Redux, again, seamlessly branched, is just on a generic silver label. So again, that's just a minor gripe, but you can see the cheapiness rearing its ugly head here and there and everywhere, actually. So the new 4K master is excellent, and it also looks excellent on Blu-ray, which surprisingly, all of the Blu-rays are remastered from the new scan, which I thought was great news. And also, some of the extras have been remastered, so it looks like Hearts of Darkness has a little bit better encoding, and you do get a couple new extras scattered throughout all 3 Blu-rays. And then the Final Cut has a new little intro from Coppola talking about how he designed it and stuff like that. It's a little, 4-minute intro piece. But anyway, but what a lot of people noticed, and you will see on the new Blu-rays, is unfortunately the Final Cut's okay. But if you want to watch the theatrical or Redux, the compression on here is not very good. So they basically shoved so much onto this and didn't do the compression very well. But all that aside, the new master is so good that even though the compression is pretty bad on this, it's still a better Blu-ray disc than the full disclosure version because the color timing, the lighting, everything is stellar. I don't know, I did not expect it to be this good, but this new master is fantastic. Of course, they were gearing everything towards you popping in the Final Cut disc. So if you watch the Final Cut Blu-ray, it does look better because the compression is a lot better. The Final Cut also has the Atmos mix. Unfortunately, they decided, or they were just not thinking about it, if you watch the 4K Redux or theatrical, you can enjoy the new Atmos mix as well. But what you can't do is play the original audio track for either one. For that, you have to pop in the Blu-ray. So that's a huge oversight, even though the new Atmos mix, to talk about that for a minute, I did listen to it. I did do a lot of comparisons. I don't currently have Atmos, but of course you can listen to it in 7.1 and get most of the general idea. So they really didn't change anything. It's more about expanding. And they also used what's now referred to as the Meyer Sound is the company, but they now call it Sensual Sound. And the new Atmos track has an impressive amount of low-end frequency enhancement, so much so that most people's subwoofers are not going to be able to go that low. It's getting so low into the subharmonic frequencies on the new Atmos track that you're very much likely not going to be able to hear it, which my sub is pretty old, so I know I did not get anywhere near that. But I could already tell that there was a lot more extra stuff going on there. But again, it's not anything that changes the audio track. It's about enhancing the atmospherics without changing effects and stuff. So this is really completely opposite to the crappy, awful, revisionist Warner Brothers Atmos remixes that we've been getting. This is what Atmos should be, and they spent a lot of time and money on getting this right. They worked with everybody at Dolby on their Atmos teams. They worked with Meyer Sound, and they worked with Coppola. And I think Walter Murch was definitely consulted because he would be the first guy you'd need to consult. So this is definitely, I was afraid it was going to be just stuff going everywhere, but it definitely did not appear that way at all. So the Atmos mix gets a thumbs up for me, actually, which is, I didn't think I was going to say that, but I was very pleasantly surprised. The only other thing technically, if you do look at the Blu-ray disc in the original mix, of course, because the compression is so bad, it's not as strongly encoded as the old full disclosure. So the old full disclosure was DTS HDMA at 24-bit, whereas this new Blu-ray is, of course, Dolby True HD, and I think it's 16-bit. But if you play the two back-to-back, you don't really notice a whole lot of difference in the audio, but that is just something to note. But of course, if you have 4K capability, you're not really going to be watching the Blu-rays, but because the 4Ks don't have the original audio on them because somebody goofed, yeah, you have to look at the Blu-ray for the original audio. And that being said, this new master is stunning. This is the best I've ever seen the film. It looks phenomenal. But again, if you're watching the Blu-ray, it's kind of compromised because the compression is so heavy. But again, the new transfer is so good that it even looks good on Blu-ray despite all that. So this is a necessary upgrade. And the fact that this is currently hovering around 20 bucks is just ridiculous, because I figured I was going to have to wait for this to go on sale for years. But this is just one of the titles that every time it comes out, it's an instant upgrade for me, because this is so important and so just enormous in its impact every time. As Gary says, you are never too young for Apocalypse Now. Yeah. So yeah, this, again, if you can live with the various snafus and the packaging not being well protected, and the fact that the Blu-ray is too overcompressed and stuff like that, the fact that this thing is so cheap is just, I can't believe it. So this would definitely be one of those grab it before it goes off sale. And you even get a digital copy for those who like those things. You know, yeah, I was blown away, actually, because I knew they were doing the 4K screenings of the final cut, and I'm like, yeah, well, I'm curious to see what it looks like when it comes to disc. You know, I hope it's better than the old Blu-ray. But I did not expect it to be this good. So. Yeah, I got to say, the Laserdisc does hold up pretty well. And what's really cool, the best feature on the UHD set that nobody talks about, there's a little 2-minute feature, and they literally go through and do a comparison of everything from the original VHS pan and scan release to the new 4K version. And they use the Ride of the Valkyries helicopter attack sequence, and it literally starts and it says VHS 1981, then it goes Betamax 81, Laserdisc 81, and then it shows the VHS remaster and the 91. It doesn't do the 91 Laserdisc. It shows the the 91 VHS tape, and then it shows a clip from the AC3 Laserdisc. And what's really interesting is seeing all that from whatever source they took. Some of it has aliasing and stuff, but you can see over the years how it's gotten better and better. But to be honest, none are bad. And you can see, like I was talking, even the old pan and scan discs, there is something that to the fact that the image still works in 133. But nobody talks about that in the reviews. But I was like, what's this one? And I click on it and I'm like, holy crap, they're doing all of them. And it's like actually it shows them on the mixing stage, and they've got a projector going, and it's just projecting, you know, and it's got a little bit of text that says Betamax 81. I'm like, wow. But yeah, I do still think the Laserdiscs are excellent, either one. Honestly, I love both of them. But yeah, the AC3 disc is really great. But you can also get that very first Paramount DVD if you want. But of course, you'd have to live probably with early DVD fun like edge enhancement and chroma noise and compression artifacts and all that stuff. But yeah, that's also the same master. Oh, A-Tracker says, I'm 16 and know I can watch some R-rated films, so ask my parents if I can watch Apocalypse Now. Yeah, you definitely should. You definitely should. That's actually a good age. I saw it, of course, quite a bit younger, but yeah, it's one of those films. You know, it's not necessarily for everyone, but I do think it has definitely some universal themes in it. And to talk about that some, I'll talk about it a little bit because Apocalypse Now is not just a film about Vietnam. It has a pretty long production history most people don't know about, but the original idea that was proposed at American Zoetrope, which was Coppola's company, when it was originally going in the 1960s, was the idea of finally trying to adapt Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, which is, of course, one of the great novels of all time. And the fact that everyone had tried to do it and not been able to for various reasons. And the idea was to adapt Heart of Darkness, but to basically use the setting of Vietnam and the Vietnam War to give it a modern day parallel, but you're still basically telling the same story. So, of course, it's the same idea, journeying upriver to find this mysterious man named Kurtz, who has basically gone insane and with ideas and thirst for power and glory and a god complex within the deep jungles of the world. Of course, this takes place going up through the Congo, so it's actually in Africa. It's nothing to do with Vietnam, of course, but the idea to transpose this into Vietnam, I think, was absolutely genius. If you've never read Heart of Darkness, you absolutely should. Again, it's one of the great novels. And the interesting thing is that someone did try and almost made Heart of Darkness. And I wanted to show a picture. This was part of what got Coppola and everybody interested, because they all were like, well, if Orson Welles couldn't get Heart of Darkness made, who could? And Orson, of course, proposed Heart of Darkness as his first film for RKO. And they were in pre-production, and it was the very last minute when RKO backed out because they feared going over budget. So here is the makeup test done with Orson as Kurtz back in the late 30s. So here's a side shot. See if I can get it to focus a bit. And you can see the whole look of weathering they were trying to get. And again, this was just a preliminary test, so it's a little bit rough, but it is very striking. And again, they were fully engaged in pre-production, so this would have been Orson's first film had RKO not backed out at the last minute. And the reason why he chose it is it was one of the episodes they did for his Mercury Theater on the Air. I believe it was aired in 1938, so it was a good choice. And that's, for example, the reason why after Kane, Orson went and did Magnificent Ambersons, because that was another famous novel that they adapted, and it did very well on the Mercury radio show. So he was going through different ideas and nothing was sticking. And Heart of Darkness took off. And again, it got to the point of The studio backed out primarily because he wanted to have so many natives in crowd scenes that it would cost them so much, and it was, getting to be, almost wartime. So it wasn't in the era of rationing quite yet, but it was getting there, and he had a strict budgetary limit. And so that's basically what led to it kind of falling apart. The other thing was that he wanted to try and use a subjective camera. So the fact that the character that we follow throughout the book, who's named Marlowe, of course, it's Willard in Apocalypse Now, uh, would be the actual camera. So the fact is, he was trying to do a subjective first person viewpoint camera and make his first film that way, which predates all the attempts to do that by a number of years, predates Lady in the Lake by about 6 years. I don't know if that would have worked, but he was really trying to break down barriers for sure. But that was the big attempt at doing Heart of Darkness that unfortunately fell apart. So that's what gave everybody the impetus to try it again. And so John Milius wrote the original script, Apocalypse Now, transposed it to Vietnam, and the idea was that George Lucas would direct it, and they would do it low budget. And then their brilliant idea was to go over in the middle of the Vietnam War and shoot this with 16mm handheld cameras and make it really rough and raw and low budget. And fortunately, wiser heads prevailed, and they realized that was not such a good idea. So it got shelved. And then when Zoetrope fell apart after Warner Brothers dumping THX 1138, basically the whole company fell apart. Everything was going into bankruptcy, and Coppola went and did The Godfather to try and make money. Of course, The Godfather became so hugely successful that that changed everything. And so a couple years go by, and everybody's kind of gone their separate ways. And after Godfather 1 and Godfather 2 and The Conversation, Coppola decides to get Zoetrope up and running again. And they didn't have any new material. And then he realized, oh wait, we still have this old Apocalypse script going around. Well, maybe I can do something with that. So that's why Apocalypse all of a sudden it came back, 10 years after it was originally proposed, and that's why Coppola wound up making it. And of course, the idea was also, again, to just go over to the East and shoot in the Philippines, basically shoot Milius' script. And then it devolved from there, and the rewrites and the fact that everything just fell apart in the Philippines and kept going, and then Coppola basically had to sink his entire personal fortune into the film to keep it going and mortgage his house. And Harvey Keitel originally played Willard and was replaced after the first couple weeks by Martin Sheen. And then, of course, Martin Sheen had a heart attack in the middle of shooting, which disrupted further things. And the set blew down during, I think it was during a typhoon. The big, gigantic Kurtz compound was just literally demolished. And then I think another set blew off and drifted away down the river as well. So they had every problem imaginable, and this stretched out for years and years and years to where it became a joke in the industry, that it was no longer called Apocalypse Now, it was called Apocalypse When, which they used to torment Coppola and everybody by printing that all over in big ads just to mess with them. And then, of course, when they got back, after all this time, they'd shot over 1 million feet of film, and then the post-production was so massive that you had, I think, I can't remember if it's 4 or 5 editors who actually worked on it, because the process was so long that people had to move on to other things they were contracted for. So they had to move on to other films, and new people had to come in. So Walter Murch basically came into all of this, and everybody's like, well, you're the newest person, so you're the only one who's not crazy yet. And so the idea was that they would each edit sections and then come back, and other people would tweak other sections. So where you had a sort of feeling of, gosh, what's the word I'm looking for? A feeling of consistency. So it wasn't like, some person cut exactly 20 minutes and nothing else, and it was like 20-minute blocks. So anyway, basically what I'm trying to say is the post-production stretched out for months and months and months. And I think that's what really made the magic of the film, because if you watch all of the scenes and you watch Redux and everything, and then you watch just the sparsity, the sparseness of the original version, the fact that they had all this material and they decided they didn't necessarily need all of it. Is complete restraint, and I think that's what makes the film so special. The fact that it's hypnotic and it's so suggestive and so powerful, and the fact they're able to do all this and whittle it down to 2.5 hours. So that's again, I think that the original theatrical version is the definitive version. But again, I do like seeing the extra stuff, and it would be really cool if we could see that work print, restored on a disc at some point. But of course, it has not happened yet. Let's see. Possibly top 10. I would cheat, give it an 11 out of 10. Yeah. Um, I always find it hard to rank stuff, but yeah, Apocalypse is just, it's an experience. Like Coppola said, my film is not about Vietnam. It is Vietnam. And while that may sound pretentious in a way, I could see what he's getting at. It's not proposing that it's trying to tell the whole story of the conflict, but all of the strange things that you as the audience go through along with Willard. It's like a microcosm of the entire experience of that theater of war and conflict and just insanity. So I think that's the perfect statement about the film, even though most people would think it sounds pretentious. Yeah, connoisseur. It should have, the UHD should have a slip box, but yeah, if you can pick one up in the store, just make sure you check all of them to make sure there's no dings on it. I know a lot of people have already given up and just taken beat up ones. So you got some AC3 talk going on. Yeah, happy with having multiple copies of it. Yeah. Honestly, though, I mean, the UHD is so good. And the fact it carries over everything, it's actually one of the few times you don't have to hang on to everything else from before. But if you're like me, by the time you've collected all this stuff and watched all of them over the years, and you're like, hey, the packaging on this one's really good. And then the fact that if you decide to get rid of it, you might get 10 cents from eBay or something. It's like, well, might as well just put it back on the shelf. But yeah, I mean, the UHD, despite its flaws and some of the cheapisms and stuff, it is really, really good. So I am amazed at the quality for the price and stuff. I just wish it had those, hiccups ironed out. Oh, okay, okay, yeah, oh yeah. The when in Redux, when Killer comes off helicopter and says, "Give me some room to breathe." Yeah, that's the little things like that. I'm fine with being in there in Redux, but like when they steal the surfboard, it's just so goofy, and it's like that doesn't even fit. It's just like Willard is so serious, and then all of a sudden they're like, I'm gonna steal his surfboard. Yeah, that's right. Oh yeah, that's what we're gonna do. And then we're gonna go off, and no one's gonna come after us. Okay. um, but there are little things, and I mean the biggest thing is the plantation sequence because it's so long. But again, I like the idea of it. I like what happens. It just goes on for so long, and then there's the random evening after scene, and I was like, okay. And it's the same thing with after we see the USO show with the Playboy bunnies, and that's an interesting interlude. How it basically turns into a frenzy of sorts with all the soldiers losing their minds. The fact that then they have the extra scene where they randomly spend the night with them and are hungover the next morning, and I'm like, why? Why is this here? Like, I get it, like stuff like this happened, but I'm like, this seems very superfluous, and everything like that I think really detracts from the narrative flow, because every time they get off the boat and they're not going down the river, it's like we're getting farther away from Kurtz. The whole idea is we have to get to Kurtz, and everything is just drawing them in, and it's this journey that only goes in one direction. So every time you deviate from that, you're stopping the momentum, and the idea is it's just like this hypnotic, it's like you could almost picture Marlon Brando at the end of the river, just like with puppet strings, like "Come to me," But that being said, I again, I like certain small things. And again, I would love to be able to just sit there with my remote after I watch the movie and be like, okay, I'll watch this scene and that scene and that scene, and not just have to dig through Redux. Um, yeah, Pete, I was talking about that earlier, the earlier genesis of Apocalypse, and with Lucas directing of the Melia script, and yeah, I did forget to mention that. There's flashes of it in Apocalypse, but the absurdist elements, the dark comedy elements, like it basically shows up most in the Kilgore scenes where Kilgore's strutting around. The I love the smell of napalm in the morning. The fact that he's playing a Wagner, and the fact that they're just talking about surfing the whole time and they don't care about anything else. And Charlie don't surf and all that stuff. That's totally absurdist when you look at it. And I think that is much closer in tonality to what the original Apocalypse Now started as. And it basically imagine that sort of tone with 16 millimeter and more documentary style photography, and the crazy idea they had to go over and shoot this in the middle of the Vietnam War because they thought that was a good idea. Guys, uh, were you doing too much substances you shouldn't have been doing? Because that is the stupidest thing I've ever heard of. But if I remember correctly, I think they even described like the opening sequence. I think it was supposed to be like a bunch of people stacked up, and then there's a guy with a flamethrower, and he was supposed to spray a flame across the screen. And the idea was they were going to be using a widescreen shot for that shot, and it was going to go across the screen and spell out the title "Apocalypse Now" across it. Um, Peak, yeah, it's Tube City, yeah, exactly. So I definitely think that entire sequence, the absurdity inherent in it, is what they were maybe originally shooting for in terms of the original concept. Um, so I definitely, and it's cool to see. I think there's flashes of it still in there, and it helps to flesh out the absurdity of that entire time period. And it actually manages to dovetail in with all of the thematics of Heart of Darkness, which, if you've read Heart of Darkness or you're reading it, it's not a laugh a minute story. It raises so many of the big questions of life itself that it's extraordinarily deep and heavy. So the fact that they were able to inject a bit of absurdity and madness into this, something this deep, I think is just incredible. So while it's not at the levels of Doctor Strangelove, it's certainly, got some similar ideas going on. Well, they're just talking about, yeah, some films get tons of releases on every format, and then others none at all. So Paramount, where's the 4K release of The Untouchables? Well, they did repackage it recently. At least you got that. It's just the old Blu-ray with the even worse cover art and the same old crappy transfer that's all mushy looking and stuff. Yeah, I haven't heard anything, but Paramount is now doing 4K, so it's possible it would sell. I definitely think they would do it before other titles. But yeah, that one would be great. It'd be great to see that the photography of that in 4K and the production design and stuff. Um, yeah, that's one that really needs a remaster, because that master is very old and not very good and very mushy and just nasty looking and no new extras, and it's a old sound remix from the DVD era, just a bunch of stuff going on. Um, Even if a 4K is perfect, I like to have multiple copies because I'm a fan, and because I often use the other older versions as the go-to. Yeah. Oh no, you're preaching to the choir, man. Absolutely. Yeah. Plus, it's interesting always to have the varying history of a film, and then it's always nice every once in a while to be like, you know what? I feel like seeing the best they could do in 1994, just because I feel like firing up the Laserdisc, or I want to look at the old VHS release I grew up with for whatever reason for a minute, and then play it for 5 minutes and go, oh God, this was a mistake. How did we ever live with this? Let me stop it. Um, but yeah, it's a part of film history that's totally overlooked and not talked about at all. Video history. If you're not just talking about transfers, but packaging, and of course, packaging is going the way of the dodo bird in terms of originality and attention to detail. And with the onslaught of streaming choices, you know, you're lucky if you're getting a physical disc release at all half the time. Um, but you know, that being said, you can see the evolution in just Apocalypse itself, because you know, this really interesting DVD package, and then this interesting, simplistic but well done Blu-ray package, and then this lovely looking but clunky UHD package. So and then of course the you know, the aforementioned issues with the disc compression and stuff. So again, it's unfortunately not perfect, but you know, sometimes it is really helpful to have multiple versions, and then sometimes you have to, because it's like the studios insist. We've screwed this up in one particular way, so you have to hang on to um, this DVD or something, or let's see, what's another one? Or Dial M for Murder. Well, we finally restored the 3D version, but the film's in 185. So if you like the old 133 version, you got to hang on to the DVD, because, um, you know, stuff like that. There's always something. Um, let's see. Right now it's about playing Atari. Oh, you know, I do occasionally. I've never owned the 2600 or anything, but my dad actually had the I always mix it up if it's the 5200 or the, I think it wasn't, it was the 7200, the big awful monstrosity that never worked, and I inherited that as a kid, and I spent like an entire weekend once just trying to figure out how the darn thing worked, only to figure out that it didn't work. And then years later I see all the videos and stuff about people ranting about how terrible they are and how they don't work, and I'm like, oh, I wish I knew that when I was a kid that weekend. So, um, but yeah, I've played a number of the Atari classics on emulation and stuff, and you have to use your imagination, of course. But you know, Pitfall is still a classic. E.T. is still a classic of pain. But I vastly prefer Atari in the arcade. So anytime I see a classic Atari arcade cabinet of anything, I'll try it, even if I suck at it. Let's see, talking about the director's cut of Scream on Laserdisc. So I didn't know if that was exclusive to Laser or not. So I've seen a couple people have that, but I've never. I'm not really a Wes Craven fan or anything, but I don't know if that is a Laser exclusive, then that would definitely be one to track down as like a LD exclusive title. But a number of those are usually where it's be like Tombstone, where it's extra scenes just tacked on at the end. But let's see. Oh, it's on VHS too. Okay. I guess it was maybe one of those home video masters, like the Lethal Weapon director's cuts that was available for a while and is now gone. Um, let's see. Oh, Connoisseur's checking out. All right, have a good night, man. Yeah. Oh, checking out my old Disney collection video. Yeah. Um, yeah, hopefully I can one day one day pick up the all the ones I'm missing. But yeah, always tons to talk about there. Have a good one, man. Let's see. New 4K UK deluxe reissue of Wizard of Oz is similar to the Ultimate Oz laser box. Wow. I didn't know. I hadn't seen the UK one. I figured it would be the same as the American one with the. I gotta say, the American 4K art cracks me up because it has the tornado halfway through, and it just looks really cheesy and stuff. I mean, I'm happy they're doing it. So I'm like, I think everybody needs to probably support it just to show that, the interest is out there, but it's not going to include all the old extras. It won't have lossless mono. So yeah, I definitely need to get some of the older releases just for the extras because I was hoping this one would have all of them, but I don't know. I guess I might just pick up like one of the old like multi-disc DVD sets where a lot of those were made or something like that. I'm not a giant fan of Wizard of Oz, but anytime Warner Brothers has a huge title like that, I do like digging through all the extras of like that, Gone with the Wind, stuff like that, because I'm an extras junkie. So I hate missing any extras, even if I only watch them once or twice. Um, oh, it's got art cards and a printed map and everything. Okay. I guess they got the Warner Boxo swag and we didn't. That's what I always call it, the Warner Boxo swag. The Blu-ray boxes they do, they're this big, they don't fit on a shelf, and it's like, get your Gone with the Wind luggage tag and your Casablanca coaster and your book about Scarlett's dress, that one scene and stuff like that. It's like, or a music box that's really cheap looking, and I'm like, why? Like, can I just like take out the Emery case and just send this back and get like 15 bucks back? Because this is all just, I mean, I guess it's nice, but I don't want that. Um, yeah, that's interesting. UK gets a box of swag and we don't. That's really weird. Usually it's the other way around. Um, oh, Wells' Heart of Darkness is one of it's like one of the Kubrick Napoleon-esque scenarios. Yeah, it really is. Like if you this book I think has the best description of it. Of course, it never got into production, but this is Frank Brady's Citizen Wells. This is a biography from about 92 or so. This is the first one I read. And it's still really, really good. I think this is still the best overall book on Orson. There's a lot of other books now, like Simon Callow has a 3-volume biography, and Pat McGilligan wrote a whole book about Orson. Orson up to Citizen Kane. So there's a little bit about Heart of Darkness in there, and there's a bit about Heart of Darkness in the Callow books, but Brady does a really good job about describing the production and the usage of subjective camera and stuff. So if you want to read more about it, you can get this book for super cheap because it's pretty old now. But this one, I think, gives the best description about what they were going for. And of course, you can also listen to the Mercury Theater version. The radio broadcast is included on the later versions of Apocalypse Now, which is pretty cool. But of course, that's sort of quasi-public domain, so you can just usually pull it up on YouTube or something if you really want to hear it. But of course, the quality is not so great, but that'll give you a real idea of what it would have, felt like and such, because you have Orson narrating and you have the rest of the Mercury Theater cast who would have populated the rest of the cast like they did in Citizen Kane. But yeah, that is one of the great what ifs. Of course, we wouldn't have gotten Kane then, or it would have been different. But Heart of Darkness in 1940 with a subjective camera. I mean, wow, that's just like, yeah, they probably would not have showed that anywhere. Everybody probably would have freaked out. Talking about Kubrick's Napoleon, yeah, some people say greatest script ever written and all this stuff, but it's hard to visualize, and it's hard to imagine the direction and the tonality he was going for. In a lot of ways, I resigned myself to being kind of happy that it didn't happen because we got Barry Lyndon out of it, and I think Barry Lyndon in a lot of ways is a lot of the unfulfilled ideals and stuff for Napoleon, but. I just don't know. I don't know what it would have been like. And for a while he was thinking about having Jack Nicholson as Napoleon, and that in and of itself is a strange, different, interesting idea. So, I definitely think it's quite possibly the greatest project that was never realized that has ever been in motion pictures. There's a number of those, like, people having their dream projects that never got off the ground, or the fact that David Lean could never make his version of the Bounty story, although he tried for many, many, many years. All the films that he didn't make after Ryan's Daughter is just staggering. So Kubrick's Napoleon is right in there, right alongside the unmade Hitchcock projects, especially Frenzy Kaleidoscope, which is the great lost Hitchcock film, probably. But yeah, it's right in there with the other, untold, unmade legends that all we can do is just read about. But there are, apparently versions of the script floating around on the internet. I've read a couple segments of what are purported to be from it, but I'm not a giant Napoleon expert, so I don't know about their, complete historical accuracy and attention to detail, etc. But yeah, it definitely would have been something. But pretty much because the failure of the film Waterloo, that made all of the financiers get super cold feet, and that's what put the ice on it pretty much permanently. Oh wow, Garrick's got the your copy of Heart of Darkness is the one Coppola was carrying around. Let me see. Be cool to see if what version it was. So there's a picture in here. Let's see. See if I can find it, because it'd be really cool to notice exactly what one he was using. Oh, okay. Oh, so he had the old, let's say this is the Signet edition. So the old Signet Classic edition with that picture. I have to say, I do have a number of old Signet Classic paperbacks like this of a similar age, and I do like all of the cover art they use. Sort of, they're not all. It's not exactly surreal, but there is a certain quality to it. So I'll have to try and find that now. Actually, I'd forgotten that was in here. That'd be really weird. Be like, yeah, get your Signet paperback of Heart of Darkness, and then go over and do a location tour in the Philippines. That would be really meta. And then walk around doing that, listening to Coppola's commentary. Just be like, yes, I'm on the economy tour version of the A Walk Through Francis Madness, the Apocalypse Now tour. Wow, that would be weird. Although, it would be a kind of cool tour to go on, but probably very miserable, just for the location treks and stuff. Yeah, I think Heart of Darkness being made at RKO, I mean, they were already having to make concessions to the fact that it was 1940, and they were already pushing a lot of barriers. And I think had they used the subjective camera, I think it might have been a bit too much. So yeah, I mean, and we got Citizen Kane out of it, and we got eventually Apocalypse out of it. But yeah, it's just interesting to read how they were actually going to try and get it off the ground in 1940. But yeah, I think it probably would have just bombed and probably not been taken seriously and all this stuff. So it's good that it didn't happen for a lot of reasons. Oh, Ronald dropped in. Hey man, how's it going? Oh no worries. Just talking Apocalypse Now and Heart of Darkness and the original version in 1940 that didn't get made. But yeah, it's definitely, I would recommend listen to the Mercury Theater radio version to get a good idea of what just basically imagine that being transposed to a film version without the subjective camera to get like a general idea of what a 1940 movie version would have been like. So I will say the one thing they couldn't have done that I still love to this day. I absolutely love Dennis Hopper's mad photojournalist character. Like every time he pops up, it's just like I can watch that insane guy for hours. Had they made the absurdist black comedy version, you could have had him on the boat the whole time. So just all this insane stuff going on. Half the boat is tripping on acid the whole time and doing all this stuff, and then you have Willard trying to get to Kurtz and all this insanity going on, and then Dennis Hopper's in the background the whole time. He's a poet warrior in the classic sense, man. And he's talking about a tree. You know? So yeah, I could sit there an entire picture of Dennis Hopper's mad photojournalist. It's like, I'm gonna kill you, and he meant it, man. He meant it. As he figures out how to strap more than 40 cameras on his own person at any given time. Like, wow, like that just yeah. Like, how did they come up with that? It's just they stacked one thing on top of another and one more crazy idea. It's a perfect way of showing how practically everybody had gone mad at that point in time. And then will this happen to the guys once they get there, and how will each of them react? And um, I do like some of the additional Kurtz dialogue and Redux and some of the deleted materials, but then some of it just goes on, and it's Brando gonna use because could he be reading the newspaper? I don't know. And then when he reads the Hollow Men in the entirety, and then it goes on and on and on, it's like, okay, I get it, but there's a reason why we trimmed this down back in the day, Um, but yeah, I think it's such a hypnotic experience that even when you watch it again, it's like you feel like you haven't soaked it all in, and that you have to watch it again, or you could just watch it on an indefinite loop. And it's really one of those experiences that that does not come around all that often. Um, Maybe it wasn't worth the level of personal sacrifice that some people had to put into it, and the fact that Coppola's entire life savings and house and everything were mortgaged to the hilt, and Martin Sheen had a really bad, near fatal heart attack and everything else. But it definitely was worth something. It's such a towering achievement for all of that pain and strife and such. So um but yeah, that's my spiel on Apocalypse. So for those looking for a better, more deeper experience, the new UHD release does have a couple new extras, but it's basically just all of the old extras carried over. So but every time I rewatch the film anyway, I usually dig through all of them. So I'm going to re-listen to the commentary, and started rewatching Hearts of Darkness and all that stuff, because once you start thinking about Apocalypse, you can't think about anything else for a long time. I remember the first time I saw it, I thought about nothing else for like the next week. I'd be sitting in school, and in my head, I just hear Brenda's voice, the horror, it just or just feel the gaze of Martin Sheen as Willard, and just thinking about the boat going down the river, and just all of the insane visuals, and just the impact is so huge the first time you see it, especially. So I was just sitting there for like a solid week in school, just as a kid, just like, is any of this meaningful? It's like you see a movie, it's supposed to be entertaining. It's not supposed to make you question life itself and think about the big questions. But Apocalypse Now is like it's just pulverizing. But again, because it is, and Coppola himself even says it is a little bit arty, it is a little bit weird, so it's not necessarily for everybody. So you'll see negatives applied to it and stuff, but it stands on its own. It's unlike anything else, and I think it's really sad that after that, I don't think I mean, I don't think Godfather 3 is horrible, but if you look at Coppola's career post-Apocalypse Now, it's just so many misfires and oddballs and things that didn't quite work, and then now he pops up every once in a while with some experimental thing or expanding the wine brand or something. So I feel it's really sad that post-apocalypse Coppola's career just kind of went, all over the place, and that he never did anything on the level of his 70s successes. And I hate to pigeonhole it to a certain time period, but when you even discuss Coppola, everybody's talking about Godfather 1, Godfather 2, Apocalypse Now. Very rarely they'll include the conversation, but that should be included as well, because those four films are what make his entire legacy, and that's the weight behind his name. Um, but outside of those, certain films have their fans, but none have ever lived up to that just insane level of greatness. And I've always wondered, was it because of the stresses of Apocalypse Now? Or was it the fact that he didn't want to do something of that ilk? Or I don't see how you go from Apocalypse Now to The Outsiders, for example. Or it seemed a bit strange. But let's see. Oh, Christopher's here. Hey, man. Contribute. Yeah, but again, because he's so all over the place, I think he has so many other focuses than just making films. He has his gigantic vineyard and all of the other interests, and he did contribute very much to film preservation, along with it's Scorsese and everybody else. Scorsese, I think, led the charge the most for actually starting and founding the Film Foundation, and spearheading and actually performing restorations from that point onward. But Coppola was right in there with them, and that was like, I think in a lot of ways it was like the last thing that all of what they used to call the film brats, or the film school brats of the late 60s, early 70s, all the big names. It was like the last thing they all did together in the 80s, early 90s or so. And actually, Coppola was the one who got the Godfathers restored, because he was really upset that he couldn't find a good print. And then when he actually went and looked, everything was in such bad state and disrepair and deteriorating. He had to go and get that spearheaded. He actually had to go to Spielberg and Scorsese and everybody and get them to join on board and get their clout to get Paramount to agree. But yeah, had it not been for Coppola's insistence, by now all the negative for Godfather 1, especially, would just be unusable. And that was 2006, 2005. But yeah, I mean that he's still doing it, and the work on Apocalypse Now is outstanding. So, and at least they still present the theatrical version, unlike some other people that we won't mention. Who could that be? I don't know. You guys can fill in the gaps. um, let's see. Ronald snuck in. Late for class. Oh man, good to know I'm like a stodgy old professor. Does that mean if I don't show up for 15 minutes, everybody can leave if the stream starts and it's just like 15 minutes? Then everybody's like, okay, it's 15 minutes. We can go now. Yeah. Oh gosh, yeah. Had that not happened, it might have been an Alamo situation. Yeah. But yeah, the Godfather negative was in atrocious shape, and Godfather 2 was really bad, but Godfather 1 was the one that had the most problems and damage and overprinting and stuff. But yeah, the Alamo is the one that MGM just let go, and it's going to take so much money and work nowadays that had they gotten on board and listened to people, even 5 years ago, it wouldn't be as bad. Yeah, and that is a good point, because if you listen to Coppola talk, he's still a great raconteur, and he's still, and it's hard to think how old these guys are getting now, but even on this new stuff on Apocalypse, he does have this great energy and about pushing the boundaries of film, because he's worked with indie groups and doing all of these like CG animated projects or something, I think it was, in the digital realm, and then he suddenly came back and made the strange films like Youth Without Youth and Tetra, which was in black and white, and then what was it, the weird quasi horror picture, oh shoot, what was it, oh man. Oh, it was Twixt, Twixt, which was kind of strange and bizarre, and but it was different. So, but yeah, it's like he's never been able to channel all of that into a great project. And again, I never could see how you went from The Godfather and Apocalypse Now to The Outsiders. Like I didn't, I don't or Bram Stoker's Dracula, where everybody is on steroids and all the dramatics are in, well, and then especially all the sexual content is like just blown out of proportion, so it makes the whole film ridiculous. Um, and yeah, the conversation is amazing, but that's the one that gets overlooked, I think, because the other three are so huge and so iconic and so well known that everybody overlooks the fact that in between Godfather 1 and 2, he makes this little movie that's a masterpiece, um, and has it just is incredible and super 70s and super dark and super depressing. Um, and in a lot of ways, the conversation is probably the most focused film he ever made. It's the tightest, it's the simplest story, but it's super tight, ultra focused, really dark, hugely impactful, with a phenomenal ending, and one of Gene Hackman's best performances, and also incredible sound design work, again courtesy of Walter Murch, and they were still working with mono at that time, so that is a really amazing mono track. um but yeah, that's the fourth of the four big ones that he did, and that's the one that I think gets unfairly overlooked because the other three are so iconic. It was the last one I saw, actually. I knew of it, I knew the title, and I knew that it was Gene Hackman. I knew the basic idea of it, but I did not know what the impact would be. So I always knew it was this little movie he made between both Godfathers, and then I finally got to see it pretty much when the DVD release came out. So I was just like, wow. First of all, this was not what I expected. And second of all, it doesn't even feel like, a Coppola movie, because it's not like the other three big ones, but it is just phenomenal. But yeah, unfortunately, because the other three are so towering, that's the one that gets overlooked. Um, oh yeah, Peter Jackson doing the "They Shall Not Grow Old." Yeah, the technological advancements, even in the past couple years, for film preservation, scanning, restoration, and just the greater technical ability to reproduce images is just exploded. So even comparing a release from 2009, 2010 to something from 2016, when we could finally do 4K stuff, the parameters are just enormous. So if you scan something now, even if it's damaged or it has faded color and stuff, you can have so many more options to try and restore it, compared to what you could even 5, 10 years ago. And the ability you have to basically do it better is so stunning. Like everything, even simple stuff like correcting judder or stabilization, or better color timing. You have so much greater control over stuff now. So it's definitely amazing to see how far we've come technically in just a very short time. Uh, I will fill in the gaps. Warner Brothers. Yeah, well, I was kind of directing that to a certain guy we mentioned earlier. Uh, a certain guy who I'd like to have a conversation about film preservation with. That would be really great. Maybe when George's museum opens, maybe we can talk about film preservation. You know, because it would be cool to go to his museum, which I always forget. It's like the Museum of Narrative Storytelling or Narrative Visuals or something. That's got the really fancy title. It's supposed to be about narrative storytelling and motion arts and stuff. But yeah, that's always the one. It's like George, you realize all that you're saying. You also have to apply to yourself, right? Like there's okay, just checking. Do I have to get? Yeah, I have. Actually, kind of a mishmash. I just wanted to get the original open mat versions with digital sound of The Godfathers. I got the actually it's hard to find the box set of those. It was the first Paramount box set. But I got one. It was really beat up, and the seller didn't realize there was a disc missing, so then I had to go and get I think it was part two separately. So I have basically the open mat digital mono versions, but I have that box set, but I have the part two separately because the box was missing one disc. But honestly, if you're going to get the Laserdisc, those are probably the ones to get because you have the original mono. It's lossless, so it's better than the Blu-rays even. And they are well presented, opened up. They look pretty good. And then later on, when the THX Masters came out, and then they got recycled for DVD, you had those awful 5.1 remixes with the new gunshots, and they tried to clean them up, but they were already so far gone. They didn't look very good, and they were very dark and stuff. And again, that's what turned up on the DVDs. So I know a lot of people like those because they're THX and they're widescreen and they have 5.1 and all that stuff, but they're pretty pricey these days, and you can get the original ones for dirt cheap. And again, I'm a purist, and the first way I even saw them was renting the double VHS tapes that were also open mat and had the mono and stuff. So in a way, it's kind of like a better way than the first time I saw them. But yeah, that's what I have. So I have basically the digital sound 133 versions of Godfather 1 and 2, and then the video version of Godfather 3 and Dolby Pro Logic. But it's I think that one is also 133. I don't know. I don't think that one's widescreen either. Um, yeah, new studios and companies can fix many films. It's just getting the money to do it. It's the money, the desire, and actually having somebody working at those companies who really cares about all of that stuff. Oh no, Pete, that is not cheesy at all. I agree. I think the usage of Satisfaction and Apocalypse Now is another one of the greatest usage of source music in any film ever. It's also it's a marvel of sound design. If you look at that, it's all about uh, and this is something Murch has talked about in other films, but it's a theory that Murch ascribes to, and basically kind of found it in a lot of ways. He did the same thing on American Graffiti and THX 1138, and it's also in when they did the reconstruction of Touch of Evil. Murch did the supervisory work and was astonished to find that what Wells was trying to do was exactly what he did in the 70s, which is to have sound try to be completely realistic. So if you look at the particular scene in Apocalypse Now, it's coming over a little radio. So it starts out very tinny. It's out of a little handheld transistor radio. And then eventually, for dramatic purposes, it comes out to fill the entire soundtrack. It provides this beautiful, detached, ironic commentary on the whole scene. Um, and then when it ends, it all kind of just folds back in and fades out. And that's also extremely dramatic because once that iconic chorus comes up, and then all of a sudden it's just pulled right back out, it gives the dramatic undercurrent that we're going back into you know, of Willard's head and his mindset, and preparing, steeling himself up for his encounter with Kurtz at the climax. So it's not just, yeah, again, it's not just a famous song being thrown in there. It's a song that would have been played at the time. If you notice, the radio announcer says, you know, a blast from the past, and actually introduces it. So they recreated Army broadcast radio, and you know, it's started out realistic, and then they go into the dramatized part of sound mixing, and then go use that to transition back into, okay, now we're getting back into the serious stuff. And again, I've always loved just the bitter irony that that song causes, because you have Clean dancing around like an idiot, and everybody else just kind of like, yeah. And then you have Lance doing the you know, just water skiing and just knocking everybody over and drenching everybody and knocking all of the, you know, all of the poor normal people off their boats. And it's, again, it's a symbol in a lot of ways for probably what happened to a lot of people throughout this conflict, that, you know, all of these American soldiers are going through with all this equipment, and it's just tearing up the country's infrastructure and, you know, ruining people's lives. So again, I've always loved that scene. It's so fantastic. And again, no dialogue, just complete, just total genius, simple. But again, the sound design is really, really important. And it's not just that this film was the first with split surrounds, and the first with a dedicated subwoofer LFE input, and predated the 5.1 system. It's the fact that it was, you know, the fact that Murch called himself a sound designer. You know, it was important for concept alone. You know, and the fact that you could actually design a film soundtrack to not just be getting the relevant information across, but to completely envelop an audience in the experience of the story unfolding. So again, it is the first truly modern designed soundtrack, and you could look at almost any scene. It's still astonishing that they're able to do that at that time. Uh, oh man, personal favorite Coppola picture. Yeah. Uh, uh, well, for me, it's between Godfather 1 and Apocalypse Now. It's probably Godfather 1 overall. But that would just be me splitting hairs a lot, because it's basically Godfather 1 and Apocalypse tied. Conversation's right there, and Godfather 2 is right there. But I think Godfather 1 and Apocalypse are such masterpieces of the medium, that it's just, you can't go wrong with either one, and they're both hugely, just hugely important. But yeah, if I was forced, I'd probably say Godfather 1, but I don't know. Like, they each have their strengths, but it's probably Godfather 1 does have the great focus that never deviates, and it's a straight narrative, as opposed to having, you know, dalliances with surrealism, and and you can digest Godfather 1 easily and really dig deeper into its nuances, whereas Apocalypse, you have to work harder at it, but then you can dig deeply into its nuances. So, but yeah, either one. But I do definitely prefer Godfather 1 over 2. I think 2 is a great film, is an exceptionally good film, but I don't think it's a great 100% amazing masterpiece like the first film. And I do think it's interesting that they did a test version, and then got the reaction back, took the film back, recut the time sequences really fast, and then that was suddenly the version they put out, and that's the theatrical cut. So I think it'd be cool one day to see that original test version of Godfather 2 that was cut a bit differently, and see if that played any better. I've The first time I saw Godfather 2, I was really disappointed, because I was so blown away by the first one. I mean, I loved Godfather 2, don't get me wrong, but you can look at Godfather 2, I think, and it does not hold up as well as the first one. Um, and I also did read Puzo's original novel, and that does have some of the stuff that turns up in Godfather 2. Um, and then there are all the deleted scenes from both films, and then the various re-edits that puts that stuff back in and stuff like that. But yeah, I love Godfather 2 that it does have a lot of stuff that's different, and it tries to be different, and I really appreciate that. And I think it's a great film, but it's, to me, it's not on the level of, uh, artistic triumph as the first one. And that's not to you say it's bad at all, but whereas with part one, I cannot really poke any holes in it whatsoever. Part two, I'm always kind of like, well, there's this and then there's that, but it's still great. It's still a 4-star great film that anybody should be proud to have anything to do with it. But yeah, it's one of those where I'm always like, every time I see, oh, it's a sequel better than the original. Oh, Godfather 2 is one of the best films ever made. And I'm like, well, um, but yeah, that's a fun, a never-ending discussion you can go through, and it's always a great icebreaker to just ask somebody, all right, Godfather 1 or Godfather 2, and then everybody has a different answer. Everybody comes at it from a different perspective. So, um, oh, bringing up the Donner cut of Superman 2. Oh gosh, talk about unending discussions. To this day, I still will just go around. If I have to kill some time, I can literally just sit there and think to myself, well, how would I fix Superman 2? And I'm not making this up. I have actually done this. And you can sit there and ponder it. And the answer is there is no answer. Um, because, the Donner cut does make so many improvements, but it loses important dramatic moments. You don't have the destruction of the town. They insisted on not using any Lester footage, and then they had to use the original ending, which they had to take off and use for one, and it doesn't quite work. And then they didn't have any money for effects, so the effects look really bad. And yeah, I wish they'd had more time and a bigger budget to do the Donner cut of Superman 2. But as it stands, I think the Donner cut is the better film because tonally it fits. So even though it's missing action beats, it's missing the best line of the whole movie, in my opinion, or at least the most memorable. Which it still grates me that they took out the general, would you care to step outside, from the theatrical version. Although, haven't you heard of the freedom of the press or the power of the press that's in the Donner cut? It's an okay line, but the iconic ones in the theatrical version, that always irks me. Um, but yeah, I think tonally it works a lot better because it's all of the original Donner shoot material, and you don't have all the lapses into completely different tone and photography like you do in the theatrical cut. But the theatrical cut has the destruction of the town, a couple other scenes they didn't get to shoot. Um, but then it has all the stupid stuff like the depowering effects that are really kind of cheesy, and then the whole ending sequence with the stupid uh, appearing and disappearing, and then the saran wrap Superman shield and all that stuff, and the Gene Hackman voice impersonator, and and but it was amazing to finally see the Brando footage reinstated, and that works beautifully. Again, I think you get the original intent a lot better. So it's one of those where you just have to watch the Donner cut, and you just have to understand why this turned out this way, and just live with it for the time being. Because I think all you could do differently is splice in the bits of the theatrical cut that are supposed to be there that Donner didn't get to shoot, primarily the destruction of the small town and a few things like that. And once you did that, the only other thing missing would be having a better ending and having better effects than 2006 DVD era CG effects. But if you did that, it would just rough out some of the edges. They also did a brand new sound remix for the Donner cut, which is mostly okay, but it's a bit modernistic, and I wish they hadn't done that. But they did have to, I think, do a fresh mix on all of the unused scenes anyway. But I hope Warner Archive gets to do like a TV version of Superman 2 and do just a super long version. So we might actually finally get all of the extra scenes and stuff. So that would be really cool, because I know there is a Superman 2 TV version, and they did finally do the TV version of Superman 1, which I'm still astounded that ever came out. Um, but yeah, that is a great what if question. So yeah, that is again, I think about that all the time, and I don't think there is no easy fix. Off topic, max ammo. Let's see. Godfather 1 and 2 are both complete masterpieces objectively, but one is still the best if pushed. Yeah. Um, yeah, I do. Again, I think both are great, but I think part one is just so untouchably great that for me personally, I've never. Every time I rewatch two, I'm like, oh man, this is really good, but it is not as good as part one. It's like super close, but it's like 85% of the way there, 90% of the way there, 95 maybe, but then it's just like, it's like it can't quite make it up the hill. Um, but if asked, I couldn't exactly point to anything that I think is bad. That's what's so strange. Um, let's see. Godfather 2 is like Temple of Doom. Raiders and Godfather 1 are perfect blockbusters, but Temple and Godfather 2 are the ones I find myself rewatching the most. That is, yeah, that's probably a good point. Probably because, and Temple is similar in trying to be so different and still be a continuation of the original film. So yeah, I can see that. And then rewatching those more because they feel fresher and they're not as ingrained in your head and not as talked about as much and not as shown on television as much and stuff like that. I can totally see that. Although, as you guys well know, I have no problem in totally gushing over Temple of Doom, because the way the internet and everybody will talk about Godfather 2 being a masterpiece, they do not do for Temple of Doom. Everybody likes to crap on Temple of Doom for some idiotic reason. They suffer under a delusion that Last Crusade is better. At least that's the joke I like to make. So okay, thinking that two is a more personal picture. Yeah, I can see that. Yeah, and then seeing the descent of Michael into pure evil is both fascinating and depressing. And as an Italian American from New York, the young Vito experience hits you personally. Wow. Yeah, then I can definitely see that. Yeah, that would, if you, especially when you have a personal connection of sorts, and be like, oh, so this is what I would have grown up in the 1920s. Oh, okay, all right, okay. Um, you ever read the book? Because the book does have some of the young Vito stuff in there and more background. Of course, it's mostly the story of part one, but I still love Puzo's original novel. I read that after I saw the film as a kid, and I was just like, wow. Um, it's not perfect, but it does give you so much background detail that it just completely enriched the films for me. It was very much the same experience I had reading Clark's 2001 book. Even though it tells the same story, it's a bit different, and you get more, not necessarily background detail, but so much more background ambiance, and you're able to then go back to the film and rewatch it with all of that extra experience from the book, and then be like, wow. And in a way, it's like having read Heart of Darkness and going back to Apocalypse Now. And even though it's not the same story, it's just transposing the idea to Vietnam. Uh, Once you've read Heart of Darkness, going back to Apocalypse Now, you can apply the themes and just your emotions after finishing this book back into Apocalypse and vice versa. So I always think it's interesting to look at connected works that way, and things that aren't just the movie retold in book form or the book retold as a not so good movie adaptation, things like that. But I still love Puzo's original Godfather novel, and I did finally get some of the later sequel books, but I haven't been too afraid to read them. Actually, I need to finally just do that and try them out. But there's I think they've done like 3 or 4 by now. But yeah, that's. But then again, I did play the Godfather game, and I love the Godfather game, as you can see. So that's fantastic. If you guys love the films that have never played it, it sounds like a stupid idea. Coppola himself hated the idea, and then he was like, "Oh, this is so bad," and now he's saying that maybe there should be an Apocalypse Now game of sorts to put a new generation into the mindset of the madness of war and such. And that was just recently he said something about that. So I don't know. Maybe there'll be an Apocalypse Now game. I don't know what that would be like. It'd be like you have a controller in your hand and you get to crawl a little bit forward, but you're like suddenly you're tied in a cage, and then you have to watch a, game version of Kurtz talk about some random stuff for 20 minutes or something. I don't know. Or there's a level where you drive the PT boat up the river, and you're like, yeah, this is monotonous. But that being said, since we're talking about it, I still think this is a hugely underrated game. But the Godfather game, originally for PS2 and Xbox, it was later ported to PS3 and 360, and even the Wii, weirdly enough. But the controls for this game are beautiful. You get to use the analog sticks for all the attacks. It's basically, control-wise, it's like an upgraded version of what EA did for the Bond games, Everything or Nothing and From Russia with Love. This came out about a year or two after those. But the graphics for the time are amazing. It's still a fun game. It's probably the best, it's obviously a knockoff or a clone of Grand Theft Auto, but it is fantastic and does try to give you the ambiance and sense of 1940s New York and Little Italy and stuff. So it is very, very nice for Godfather fans. So. When it comes to franchises, my favorite is mostly the safe choices. Empire is the best Star Wars, Raiders is the best Indy, and Dark Knight as the best Batman. Goldfinger is the best Bond, etc. Except for slightly different with Terminator and Mad Max. Interesting. Well, you're not weird, Pete, because I'm with you on Max and Terminator. I think Terminator 1 is a great film. I think it's the best thing James Cameron has ever done in his life. And I think it as much as Terminator 2 is good, it's nowhere near as focused. It's yeah, the action is a lot more enormous. The budget is enormous. The effects are still amazing to this day. The CDS sound mix was amazing, but it's nowhere near as powerful as the original, I think. So, and with Mad Max, I actually go even further. I think the original Mad Max is the best film of the series, simply because it has the most story, and it's astonishing what they did for such a low budget and being completely inexperienced, and the fact that they were able to pull off those stunts and no one got seriously injured is just astonishing. The fact that they shot in scope for an Australian film, that was unheard of. Some of the photography and motion of the cameras going at speed is still amazing, even when they overcrank it. I think the score is fantastic. I think Mel's performance is fantastic. Again, the cinematography, it's just, and the direction and the editing. I don't know how these guys in Australia pulled it off in 1979. I still don't. And as amazing as The Road Warrior is, and as great as The Road Warrior is, I still wish it had more story. And for me, it's not as interesting when there's not as much story. And then you get to Fury Road, where it's about other people, and all they do is go from one end of the continent to the other, basically. And there's a guy who drives an Interceptor called Max who doesn't do much of anything. And I'm like, this isn't Mad Max. This is George Miller has fun, and yeah, it looks nice, but yeah, I go that far. I think the original Mad Max is actually the best of the series, and I even like Thunderdome. So I guess I'm weird. So, and I I was really disappointed when I saw Fury Road in the theater, and it still does not feel like a Mad Max movie at all. But taken as its own thing, it's enjoyable enough, and you get your, your money's worth for the visuals and the sounds and all the stuff going on. But I just really could connect to it because I was just like, there's not a lot of story here, guys. Um, but it's fine to go with the standard of choice. It's all about developing your own opinions, because I remember when everybody started saying, I don't know when it was, but it seems like when I was growing up, the consensus changed to be like Empire is the best Star Wars movie because it's the darkest and most adult and serious one. And then I was like, yeah, Empire is best because it's dark and serious and it's the most daring. And then I started thinking about it when I got even older, and I was like, well, without Star Wars, you wouldn't have Empire. And, the more they went on with the sequels, it wasn't as open of a universe. And Star Wars has the best villain of the series in Tarkin. And Star Wars has the amazing Alec Guinness performance. And Star Wars has a vitality and a freshness that is not in the sequels. And although Empire is dark and character driven, it doesn't have the freshness and the vitality of Star Wars. So, and then I eventually, kind of switched myself in my thinking, and I suddenly realized that I actually think Star Wars is better than Empire. But I love them both, and they're both great. But again, sometimes it's hard to fight against the overall consensus. And Goldfinger is probably the easiest one because that's um, usually the only Bond film most people know. The only one, if not, and if they know others, it's usually the first one they saw. It's the most iconic one. But there's so much more in the rest of the series if you're willing to dig into it. That Goldfinger is right up there. It's part of the original three that kicked off the whole series. But in every way, shape, or form, From Russia with Love is a stronger, more visceral, more vital picture. And you have the different directorial style of Terrence Young. It's extremely devoted to the novel, it improves upon the novel. And then Goldfinger does the same thing, but it's a different style. And it's those two uh, styles that basically inform the way the series is going to go from that point onward. But the problem was most people came into the series on Goldfinger because the success of the first two films built the word of mouth, and then they reissued the first two films on a double bill once Goldfinger became the biggest film in the world. So the first one you see affects the way you picture how everything goes. So Goldfinger kind of quickly became the de facto standard. That's what everybody pictured when you said James Bond. They picture an ejector seat in an Aston Martin DB5 and a dead girl painted gold and a giant butler with razor trimmed bowler hat and stuff like that, which is perfectly fine, but there is other stuff there. The trouble is the general consensus does not like to go much further than just a general opinion. Um, let's see, trying to real quick. Yes, Brian, the first Bond film shot in scope was Thunderball in 1965. Yeah, that was. I mean, when McClory was originally planning to do Thunderball, they even thought about doing Todd AO or 70 millimeter. But when Dr. No is being shot, the super low budget basically meant that they couldn't use any widescreen processes. So they just went for flat spherical, and they did that on the first three. And then on Thunderball, the idea was that, well, since Goldfinger became the most successful film ever, we might as well go for the big one. And they finally went to anamorphic lenses. And the scope photography in Thunderball is quite underrated. Like for its time, it's amazing. It's super sharp. Ted Moore's work on there, and if you ever see it on the big screen, it holds up amazingly well. And I think that's part of the reason why nobody knows for sure, but it doesn't seem like it was blown up to 70 millimeter. But it looks amazing in 35, and it still looks great. Even though the Blu-ray is not perfect, the photography still comes across well. And then Freddie Young, of course, came on for You Only Live Twice, and that is just stunning. But yeah, they stuck with scope ever since, except for Live and Let Die and The Man with the Golden Gun, which also were shot spherical. And those are 185 usually, where the first three, because they're full-on British productions, are usually shown at 166. But you could show them 166, 178, 185, and they'll all be fine. They've been different ratios over the years, but those are the 5 of the original films that were not scope. But scope kind of became associated with the series, and you get the greater sense of grandeur and scale, and you can show off the big sets better. And it also means that you don't necessarily have to blow up to 70 millimeters. So I think they also kind of didn't do that all that much with the series in terms of like cost cutting. But yeah, I think all of the films are shot really well. But you got to understand some have different conditions going along with them. So even though I like the photography of License to Kill, you can't get away from the fact that they had to build the sets in Mexico. You have the slightly dated 80s styling, and it had a lower budget, and they had all kinds of production problems going on. So it doesn't look necessarily as polished, but it's still well photographed. Yeah, 600,000 to make the first Mad Max, a little under 2 million to make the Road Warrior, and 16 million to make Thunderdome. Yeah, uh, but the money's all on the screen in all 3 of them. But yeah, I think Thunderdome got hurt. They don't really acknowledge this, but when Byron Kennedy died during pre-production of Thunderdome, that really messed with George Miller, because that was his longtime friend and producing partner. And that anytime something like that happens, and somebody that important, is no longer with you, it's going to change what's going on. And eventually Thunderdome was finished by another director, but I think the what went wrong on that was Miller wanted to basically make a movie about the children, and then somebody was like, "Hey, wouldn't it be cool if the guy who walked up was actually Mad Max?" And they were like, "Yeah, that's an idea." But then it's like they didn't flesh it out. So, but that being said, after Fury Road, I went back to Thunderdome, and I was like, I mean, this isn't so bad. There's good ideas in here, and there's a good movie in here, I feel, but it's just struggling to get out. But yeah, it was a lot more expensive. But again, the Bartertown set is great, and Thunderdome's iconic, and the money's all on the screen. But yeah, it's definitely a total 180 from the ultra low budget Ozploitation vibe of the original. Um, Godfather is considered one of the best examples of a movie being better than the book. Yeah, and it's really cool to read the book if you've never read it before, because it's like you can tell where they made the cuts for pacing and stuff, but it's also fascinating to read what Puzo wrote. And of course, he's writing all this before the movie was a thing, so you're reading this and trying to not picture Brando and Pacino and everybody as you're reading the book. So it's the same, but it's different. So I really liked that, and getting all the extra gory bits and details and stuff. Except for the whole bit with Lucy Mancini in Vegas, and that was the weirdest subplot of a book. If any of you guys have read the book, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. But just a little odd detour in there that I always remember. Speaking of games, Medal of Honor. I never did play the whole series, but I did play. I kind of played them out of order. I played the original, and I loved the idea of it, and I thought it was so cool that Spielberg was producing it and spearheading it and everything, and the fact that it tried to be extraordinarily historically accurate. But I remember the first one, I kind of got frustrated a little bit with the PlayStation controls, and then of course the constant loading screens that you were well accustomed to in the PS1 era. And I never did play the Resistance one they made after that, but I pretty much jumped from the original to Frontline on the PS2, which I still remember that was a pretty good game. And then I played, let's see, Rising Sun was the next one, where you were in the Pacific Theater, and that wasn't as good, but it was sort of like, it was basically like an expansion pack of the same game. And then after that, I didn't really play any other ones. And then I know EA basically or I guess it was EA or whoever rebooted it as like a modern shooter, and it just didn't work and just kind of died out. But I would like to try some of the later ones because I know there's a couple that have really good reviews. And if I'm remembering correctly, I think John Milius wrote the script for one of the later ones. I can't remember if it was like Allied Assault or Airborne or something, but I want to say that Milius wrote the game script for one of the later Medal of Honors. So I really need to check that out. He's written a couple of games. I think Homefront is another one, but I'm very hit or miss with Milius. Like, he is such a character, but of course, you know, he wrote what became the backbone of Apocalypse Now, and uh, several other things. But then, you know, it was so strange to think of this total different guy compared to, you know, Lucas and Spielberg and Coppola and everybody else being, you know, very liberally minded and very, you know, peace loving and things like that. And, and John Milius is the complete opposite. And it always cracks me up when he still pops up in the interviews, and he'll be, everybody else would be all calm and reserved, and he's just sitting there and he pulls out a cigar and just chomps the end off, and he's like, Sergio Leone was truly magnificent. Maybe like this again. You know? Um, but yeah, I need to track that down. But yeah, I guess I don't know. Sometimes if I try and go back and play like a game that old, like the original one, it's really hard to go back that far unless you really get into it. But I remember liking the original one. I guess I should just try and replay through the series and stuff. But I do like the historical Call of Duties, as I've said before. But Medal of Honor always seemed to strive more for historical accuracy, which I really appreciated. And you know, if they were able to tie that more into somehow into school curriculum, that would be a heck of a way of getting, you know, younger kids and younger generations to really get more actively involved in history. But which I know that was part of Spielberg's whole idea behind uh, starting the franchise anyway. But also apparently because he's a giant gamer, and I'm like, can we just forget all of these random Twitch streams and stuff? Can we just see like Steven Spielberg, what he's like playing games? Like, does he get frustrated like the rest of us? Does he play like normal games, or is that just too weird to think of? Because I remember reading about that and how he's produced various games like Medal of Honor, and I'm just like, yeah, I guess he's the only one who's kind of sort of a gamer, and I guess that's what led him to doing Ready Player One, or I don't know, but that would just be interesting. Uh, okay, talking about the difference between From Russia with Love and Goldfinger. Yeah, I used to always ascribe it to the difference in directors, but I think also the vibe of Goldfinger, you have a new person in the mix, and Paul Dane writing on the screenplay as a co-writer, and I think he was the one who really got the intrinsic joke, and then Guy Hamilton picked up on that. So all of the inherent humor that's peppered throughout that is in the first two films, but the first two films are much more direct. You always get the sense that Terrence Young was actively involved in everything, and no matter what, you had to still believe what was going on. Whereas Guy Hamilton had the more relaxed approach, and as he would say, let's everybody come in, let's all sit down, have a laugh for 90 minutes, 2 hours, and then go home and be walking on air and feeling better, which those are two perfectly fine approaches, and both were great directors, but it's two completely different attacks on the same material. And I've always wondered what it would have been like had Terrence Young stayed on for Goldfinger, which he almost did. There was a dispute with the producers over fees and salaries, which was not uncommon because that's what Connery was also doing, and would eventually lead to him leaving the series. And then when you get Terrence Young coming back immediately thereafter on Thunderball, even though Thunderball has some intrinsic problems, it runs a bit longer. It's not as tightly focused as the first three films. The one thing that does come back with Terrence coming back is the danger, the immediacy is immediately back, even though Peter Hunt's editing style has changed pretty dramatically in a lot of ways. So even just comparing certain action set pieces, they are totally different. Say, for example, compare even though the laser beam scene is the most iconic Bond villain confrontation, and Bond has no way out that we or anyone can see, and he's put up right to the last minute. You never get this sense until the very end of that sequence when the editing picks up that Bond is actually in mortal peril, even though he is, because the film is quite relaxed. And that is a really great approach to take. And it's interesting that they were able to make that work. But you go back to Thunderball and you pick any sequence, but say, for example, the street chase through the Junkanoo, where that starts, Bond has already been shot in the leg, and he's leaving a blood trail, and he's looking around frantically. And finally, when he escapes, he has to actually bandage his leg up, and he's actually he's actually got a bloody wound, which never happens one time in Goldfinger. And then, of course, he's caught again and has to escape again using his wits. So that's just a stylistic difference. What always irked me and still to this day kind of does is the fact that most people will just point to Goldfinger and then they act like that's the only one, or they act like all the others just kind of go together. And I'm like, oh man, really? But yeah, that's a good way to put it. Totally different vibes, and you can split hairs and dig deeply into all the differences and stuff, but I think the differences are what kept the series going, actually, in a lot of ways. Because if it had been the same way, it would have just burned out. Hamilton himself even said, he liked to do other things because he felt like his batteries were drained. So he was really happy to stay away and then come back on Diamonds Are Forever because he felt like it had been long enough. But I mean, that's I could go into Bond theory for years. Again, it's going to be really weird to see the TCM intros and outros for the later films when that happens later on this month. Like, I'm just like, I hope somebody finds a way to record all of them or something, because I would just love to see like all of them. Like, coming up next on Turner Classic Movies, we have the 1983 James Bond film Octopussy. Everybody quotes that line, but I always find it interesting. They never quote what Goldfinger says after that. They always quote, "Do you expect me to talk?" "No, Mr. Bond, I expect you to die. There's nothing you can tell me about that I don't already know." Like, that line is just as important because it shows that Goldfinger is omnipresent. He knows everything, and Bond is doomed. There's no Goldfinger's literally just leaving the room. He's like, I'm not even going to wait for you to be tortured to death, because guess what? I realized I don't care. I got more important things to do. I'm gonna go blow a hole in Fort Knox. Or go have a nice dinner or something with Mr. Ling, because I'm too good for this, I think the first three films you consider separately because they're like the untouchable ones, because they were first. They have the most energy. They have the original creative team, even though Guy Hamilton directed Goldfinger instead of Terrence Young. But they all flow into each other, and the momentum of Dr. No leads into From Russia with Love, and the momentum of From Russia with Love, the success of the first two leads into Goldfinger. And never at any time afterwards did you have the same they didn't have anything to prove. Well, they had to prove that this would work, but they didn't have a formula to work off of. They didn't have preconceived notions to deal with. They didn't have they weren't having to top the levels of the last big set piece in the last movie. They didn't have to have the great pre-title opening. They didn't have all these preconceived notions to deal with, and they didn't have all of the problems going on with everybody in the cast and crew that eventually led to people moving around and leaving and stuff. So really, it's the first three where everything was all working and all together, and they're magical. And as great as the later films are, they will never have um, that same quality, because it's not something that you can recreate. Um, it is Thunderball is untouchable. I'm getting in. I'm putting my Bond theory hat on, because when you look at all of the films, there is a difference between the first three and the rest. That's why they're so classic, because it was where it all started. And again, there weren't all these outside factors going on, and Thunderball gets accused of being too overstuffed, and at one point, when Bond has Q's giant, uh, oh, giant propeller and scuba tank on, and turns to Felix and says, "And the kitchen sink." That's basically like an underlining of the fact that Thunderball is so jam packed with stuff that it's so huge. Whereas the first three films did not have that problem, because they did not have they weren't made with the notion of, these are the most successful films in the world, and we have to make them big, and we have to make them great, and we have to be better than the last one. We have to be better than and beat all the imitators to market and stuff. So um, I think that's what makes them kind of stand apart. But again, I could make the argument for any of them. So, but yeah, like that's why they feel so special. But again, I could make the argument for Thunderball or You Only Live Twice or any of them. So, but yeah, I think that's what makes the first three kind of stand alone so much. Kind of like that with Mission Impossible. First one was really great, and while the sequels can be enjoyable, each one just has to have the set pieces and the action of the last ones. Um, I think the sequels are just a mishmash. Like, it's just yeah, the first one is a masterpiece, and the more time goes by and the more I think about it, I realize it's not just me rewatching Mission Impossible too many times as a kid. I think it's truly a great film, in every single way, and none of the sequels is matched up. Whereas every original series Bond film can stand alone as a film and work as a very good action adventure film, regardless of the fact that it's part of a series. Whereas the Mission Impossibles, at least the sequels, I think are much more generic. And yeah, they can work, but they're definitely not as polished and um, well thought out, because even if you pick out like a random sequence from one of the later Bond films, or you just think about the plot structure or motivations of characters and stuff, everything makes sense and everything is detailed, even if the plot is a bit confusing, like on Octopussy. It's like, trying to think about it. What exactly does Kamal gain from partnering with Orlov, and how did they meet, and how does this work? And wait, how does that work? um, oh gosh, I once somebody tried to ask me to explain the plot of Octopussy, and I did, and then I went further and further, and they asked how did they meet, and I'm like, that's a good question. I don't know. Maybe there was a party for exiled Afghan princes to meet top Soviet generals. I don't know. um, oh, Melinda's having to check out. All right. Yeah. Thanks for hanging out. Yeah, I think I'm about tapped out as well. Where it seems like we end all of these live streams with me getting heavily into Bond theory, but that's always good to do. It allows me to expound upon some of my weird, way too over thought out theorems and such. Um, oh, Sega saying, saying the one upsmanship starts with "Diamonds Are Forever." That's uh, hmm. I don't- I don't really know. I I don't know if the series ever got one upsmanship. I think it was just every once in a while they were like, we got to make sure if we're going to do an action sequence, it's got to be something they haven't seen before, or because we've already done so much and we have so many imitators. But Diamonds Are Forever, I think, is really misunderstood, and I think it is an astonishingly daring attempt to reconnect with an audience that they felt that they had lost. And also, coming out in 71, you have the whole changeover of the industry, and in a lot of ways I think it presages the successful um, comedic infused action films that started coming around. um, Even stuff like Peck and Pause the Getaway, or even Smokey and the Bandit, stuff like that. So I do think in a number of ways it is slightly ahead of its time. It's a very bold picture for all of the dark, absurdist humor going on. And the fact that it still manages to be a Bond picture, and you never lose the Bond character, and you never lose the fact that there's actually a Bond plot going on, and Spectre's back, and the whole setup is really interesting and original, um, and has real life parallels. So it's also the problem they had was they were dealing with the probably the most straightforward and least uh, impressive book that Fleming wrote of the originals. The original Diamonds Are Forever novel is very simple. Bond basically goes along the smuggling pipeline to follow the trail of the diamond smugglers, and after a couple set pieces, winds up in Vegas, and eventually it leads to basically a shootout in an old west town. I mean, it's very straightforward. It's a great novel. You get all kinds of Bond characteristics in his internal dialogue, but in terms of the book, it's probably the most simplistic, straightforward story Fleming wrote. So if they had just adapted that straight in 1971, most people would have been probably really disappointed. So um, and I get why. First of all, they had to reconnect with audiences. They managed to get Sean back, and they were getting Guy Hamilton back. So there were all these different elements cooking. But I think um, it's not properly accepted, I think. And I think if more people read the book, they would understand why they were having to really kind of go out there. And again, they were also having to reattract audiences that they had lost over time. And then it was post Spy Craze. So again, they were having to reach out further and be bolder. So I think if people understood that stuff more, and they realized just how diabolically funny some of the jokes are in there, that they'd understand it's a lot closer to sort of like a highly stylized, cultured British version of a Batman 66 episode. So it's partly satirical, it's partly absurdist black humor, and it's partly an action adventure film. So it's all of those things. Um, oh, Pete, talking about the bandied about idea of doing basically a period piece Bond film and doing literally doing a novel adaptation. That's been discussed on and off for a number of years. Um, the Eon has thought about it a couple times. They even considered doing the whole reboot Young Bond thing back in 1987 when Timothy Dalton came around, but Cubby Broccoli kind of nixed that idea. Um, but it's been bandied about. Uh, the idea of Pierce Brosnan doing Casino Royale was thought about as perhaps his swan song, or just doing a 1953 period set Casino Royale. But I don't know exactly how Fleming would translate in a modern day production. I don't know if they could be as bold and dark, and if that would actually translate onto film as much, because there's so much of Bond's internal monologues in the books, and it's just beautiful stuff, and his writing style. But again, I think it would take a lot of work and some extraordinarily talented people to pull it off. But also, people would have to understand that it's so completely different from the film series. Um, but that being said, Casino Royale as a film, I think, has still not been done justice. I don't think the story's been done justice because when Eon finally did it, they added so much other stuff that it detracted from everything else. And I mean, of course, they're gonna have to update the story a bit, which I get. That's fine, but it doesn't have the dramatic punch of the book because they ruined it by adding so much other stuff, and then having one of Fleming's most iconic lines be just a throwaway, and then we go on for another 20 minutes of just random stuff, and Vesper's demise is just totally botched, and then we keep going, and then we somehow have a happy-ish sort of ending, and it's like it doesn't work that way. You read the book and it's just like gutting. Um, but anyway, it's definitely possible. People have talked about it. Quentin Tarantino, of all people, talked about wanting to do Casino Royale and hinting at maybe as a period piece. And so it's been thought about. It's been talked about. Um, there's a lot of discussion on some Bond forums about how you would pull that off, but it's possible. Um, but I don't know how it would feel. Um, Brian just watched Face Off and Time Cop on Laserdisc. Yeah, it's always fun to go back to. 90s action on Laserdisc is just always a phenomenal time. Like that's the easiest recommendation because it looks great, it's going to sound great, and you totally feel like you're back in a home theater circa 1996. I think if there are any great role models for children, it's probably Mr. Wint and Mr. Kidd. I would love to get them on shirts or anything. I absolutely adore what they did with those characters because they're in the book as well, but they're more like straight up mob enforcers, and they're only in certain sequences. And like when they first appear, they have hoods on, so you can't see their faces. But Fleming describes them extremely well. But you don't get any of just the charm and ridiculous, appealing quality of the movie version with just those diabolically hysterical uh, glances and glares that Bruce Glover will give. It's uh, like that one where it's like he sits down, kid sits down. They're both on board, and I must say, Miss Case is quite attractive for a lady. It's just like you could watch them for 2 hours in a movie of their own. Like, forget the stupid Jinx spinoff that never happened. Where was the Winton Kid movie? Oh gosh. If at first you don't succeed, Mr. Kidd, try again, Mr. Wind. If God had wanted man to fly, he would have given him wings, Mr. Kidd. Uh, okay, talking about films like Star Wars, Raiders, Apocalypse, Close Encounters, Jaws. Why do they feel so cinematic? Um, well, yeah, it's because people were composing for screens. Hitchcock famously said when he saw Jaws, it was the first film he had seen that wasn't composed for the proscenium of an old school movie palace that would have, a stage for stage performances and have a proscenium arch with the smaller screen in it. And that, in Jaws, you could see that they were composing for giving you a wider field of view and using the full scope image, and they weren't worrying about the, fancy proscenium arch stage of an older style theater. Um, but all of those, you mentioned, they're all scope films. They all have phenomenal cinematographers. They were all made by, people at the peak of class of Hollywood and British production. with the modern technical advances of the 70s and 80s. And again, they weren't composing, and that none of them were watching video monitors. That's something that kills me. If you look at a set today, everybody's watching the video playback monitor. They're never watching what's going on the actual set. They're not watching the actors. They're watching a little screen, and everything's being designed to be played back on cell phones and computer screens and computer monitors, and you don't get the same sense of scale and of a worldview, at least in my opinion. That's just my whole one of my many critical theorems. I think if more people would stop looking at their playback monitors and look at what actually is going on the set itself, I think that would help immeasurably. It's like going around with blinders on. But again, you know, they used to compose for a big screen. It was how is that going to look on a 40-foot screen? I don't know. They weren't thinking about what's it going to look like on somebody's TV or somebody's cell phone or something like that. Most people don't even think about what it's going to look like projected these days, let alone what it's going to look like on a, you know, gigantic 50-foot theater screen. When a movie comes on free to air and the ads start, you just stop, grab the laser disc, and watch it from that point. Yeah, and that's the thing. You can just go straight into it. No loading, no BD Live, no Java, no internet connection, no ads. Maybe a couple trailers, which you can all skip, and yeah, right into it. So, oh, got some time cop discussion going on. Yeah, I just have the standard Laserdisc, but I'd love to check out the DTS one day. But of course, that has the massive DTS cost. But anyhow, so I guess we'll sum it all up with I think despite the issues and the packaging and stuff, I think for the price point and the amazing restoration, everybody should go pick up the Final Cut UHD of Apocalypse. And again, I was going to hold off for a while, but when I found out the new restoration is actually on all of the Blu-rays, and you can check out the Atmos mix on the Blu-ray for the Final Cut, at the $20 price point, it's just amazing. So yeah, it's not the best set in the world. It's got a couple problems, but 6 discs for $20 is just amazing. So everybody pick one of these up. It seems like they're having distribution trouble for a while because you couldn't see it on the Best Buy website, and a lot of stores didn't have it. But I just stopped at a Walmart and dug around, and it was on it. It was on one of those end cap shelf things. It's an actual shelf, but it's at the end of an aisle because their video section has shrunk down even more. But it was tucked away in there with some of the other 4Ks. So just make sure you find a box that is not destroyed. But yeah, while this thing is still on sale for this was about $22, which for 6 discs plus a digital copy, 4 Blu-rays and 2 4K discs is just like, it's amazing. So hugely recommended. Just wish it was slightly better. Like it's so close. But that being said, for those of us on here, I think the coolest extra is the awesome 3 minutes of looking at the old video versions from VHS and Betamax to Laserdisc and DVD and Blu-ray and 4K. But yeah, I'm telling you, when you pull that up and you put that on, you will get such a kick out of it because it is. I was just like, wow, they know us. They're doing what we do. I can't believe it. Let's see. 90s action goes hand in hand with Laserdisc because, in a hipster voice, it's 90s, man. You got to do 90s the 90s way. Oh, geez. I can't stand going into stores now because it's like they're everywhere. They all have their mini discourses somewhere in the back. You can hear in the back of a video of a comic shop or a record shop or something, and it's like always like 2 or 3 guys in the back, and they're loud enough you hear them throughout the whole place, and they're just like stupid stuff, and I'm just like, oh, and I'm like, no, don't do it. No, don't do it. I have to hold myself back because I'm like, oh man, I no, I shouldn't even bother. They won't get it. They're just gonna stare at me. It's gonna be a waste of time. And then I go past them and like look at the shelf for like cheap gems or something. Just like walk away, and I'm like, oh, you sad little man. Oh well. Moving on. Yeah. I try not to do that too much, or if I have to correct people, I always try to be polite and conscientious and be like, well, actually, just so you know. But yeah, it's like you go into a record store and the hipsters come out of the woodworks and you're just like, oh man, like I thought they hadn't found this one. Damn it. I guess I should go like a different time at like 10 o'clock in the morning or like 5 minutes before close when they're hopefully gone. So um, yes, Spielberg wanted to do Bond. He tried several times. He really tried post Jaws, especially, and then post Close Encounters. So that would have been the most likely era, and he was so successful that I think that success is what kind of turned Cubby Broccoli off from hiring him because they always wanted to get people that were very much more workmanlike and journeyman directors instead of hotshot directors and things. But I think had he done it in the 70s or even the early 80s, I mean, Raiders shows he could get the energy down, but I don't know that it would have worked. I mean, I can see him doing Return of the Jedi because it is more in his sensibility anyway. But I think even that would have come across more as a Spielberg movie than a Star Wars movie. So I think him doing Bond, you would have had Spielbergy touches and flourishes, not intentionally, but they'd just be there. But he definitely couldn't have done it after a certain point. Like after the mid '80s, it would have just not worked at all. But it's possible that he could have pulled off Spy or Moonraker because those are globetrotting and they're much more. They have the comedic elements and they have the action elements and stuff. And some of that played into the building of Raiders, and there are Bond flourishes in Raiders and Temple especially. Um, Raiders directly influenced Octopussy, and Octopussy directly influenced Temple of Doom, right down to the dinner table scene where Spielberg saw the stuffed sheep head in Octopussy and was like, "Wow, that's great! I can do better than that." And that's where the whole scene in Temple of Doom came from, with the stuffed snakes and the monkey heads and all that stuff. Um, but yeah, I think it was much better that he didn't do one. I would rather see the Spielberg Return of the Jedi before a Spielberg Bond film because I feel like Return of the Jedi is much closer to his oeuvre. Um, but still, I feel like if he had done Return of the Jedi, it would have felt more Spielberg than Star Wars. Um, I'm very curious about Rambo 5. I saw Rambo 4 once, and even though I thought the over usage of CG blood and massive body count was just hysterically silly, I was really surprised that they had finally gotten back to more of the serious, down to earth tone of the original movie First Blood because when I was a kid growing up, you see Stallone and Schwarzenegger and everybody walking around with the giant chain guns and bare chested and oiled up and everything. And I just thought Rambo was all about Stallone walking around mowing down people, and it was all stupid and ridiculous and stuff. And then when I saw First Blood, I'm like, oh my God, I've been lied to. This is totally different. And then I saw First Blood Part 2, and I'm like, oh crap. Like, it's just all of the intelligence and all of the dramatic depths and stuff just got sucked out. And then, so Rambo 4 was a pleasant surprise, but I really need to go back and rewatch the whole series because it's been a long time, and I usually just rewatch First Blood, so I usually skip the sequels. But yeah, I got to say, if they keep along the more serious tone, and although it is weird seeing Rambo with short hair, it's just kind of weird. But yeah, they you can really do something, whether you do it as sort of a modern age like a modernized Western of sorts, or if you do there's a lot of material there. You know, Rambo as a grizzled old man with apparently nothing to live for. You know, that you could spin that off in a number of different ways. So I'm pleasantly interested. I'll put it that way. I definitely would go see it. Whereas I do not care about Terminator Dark Fate. I saw that trailer and I'm like, wow, this just seems like super generic and pieces of the original movies we've already seen again. I don't care. Like I was watching through the trailer and I just stopped it for a minute and I'm like, I don't even care about finishing this. I know Arnold's going to show up in a second and I just don't care, you know. And then the Tarantino Star Trek, I haven't heard anything else, and that just seems so weird. And I don't see how he could ever do anything about like just the idea of what Star Trek is supposed to mean, and Quentin Tarantino on the same continent don't belong. Like, you know, uh, like just imagine like an episode of the Next Generation where they're talking about, oh, like if you do that, well, we can't do that because it would violate the Prime Directive, and we can't violate the Prime Directive. And then Sam Jackson just walks in the room and drops a couple f-bombs and like just normal Tarantino isms. Like I don't, I no, it just seems weird. Like it's weird enough that they're doing the new Picard series, and I don't know where they're going to go with that exactly. Because again, I'm still relatively new into delving into Star Trek. But yeah, it just seems like the whole spirit of what Star Trek is supposed to be about does not agree with Quentin Tarantino. But then again, the modern films are all about you know, action over everything else anyway. So I don't know. It was weird to hear of and weird to hear that they're going with it. So um, Pete would watch it because why the hell not? It would be better than the Discovery show. So okay, yeah, I've heard a lot of mixed stuff about Discovery, so I'll get there eventually. I'm going in chronological order, so I'm almost done with Next Gen, and then I got to go through the Next Gen feature films, and then Voyager and Deep Space Nine and stuff. So far, I'm really enjoying it. Like I'm really kind of mad at myself that I was always stuck in the eternal Star Wars versus Star Trek debate. You couldn't like both of them, and you had to choose one. And then I never knew what the heck was going on if I'd see random episodes on TV, and I would just be like, well, I like this because it has Bill Shatner being super Shatnery. So that's what lured me in finally. I finally was like, oh well, I got to try this. And from like the first 5 minutes where there were some plaster, it was a cardboard wall and like some really unconvincing styrofoam rocks and some goofy fisticuffs and well-intentioning uh, science fiction. I was like, where's this been all my life? So it's like I've seen pieces of the Abrams modern movies, and I'm like, wow, this. I am totally a noob, but this is not Star Trek, you know. Uh, yes, another Shadow movie would be amazing. Sam Raimi was determined to do one for years. I think he even had bought some of the Shadow rights, but I think that eventually fell apart. He kept trying to do it forever and ever, and it just never worked. And that's why he made Darkman, first of all, because he couldn't get the rights to the Shadow back then. So, of course, if you think about Darkman, you know, the whole obscured face and the hat and the long coat, it's very Shadow-esque. But then throughout I think up until just a couple years ago, he was still trying to do it, but I think he finally gave up. And I love the 94 film. The 94 film was my introduction to the character, and I've only read a couple of the pulps and a few of the comics and listened to some of the radio shows, but I'm just trying to dig into more of it. And I definitely agree. You could do, yeah, because the 94 film was a mix of the radio show and the pulp novels. If you did the straight pulp novels, like it would be fantastic. Like you could just do it straight. They would be hard R-rated, period pieces, and I think people would really like them because people have no idea if they even know the character. They don't know usually how dark the pulps are, and most people have not really read much actual pulp literature or even hard-boiled detective fiction by now. And that's a whole set of genres that is just totally underdeveloped and unexploited. Um, and then you could go the opposite. You could do something like the radio show where you have more of the magic and mysticism and more of the romantic banter that's in the 94 film. I think the 94 film was very smart in bringing in both and marrying the best elements of both to try and make a more singular, enjoyable experience. But I will say, when I think it was James Luceno who wrote the novel, he wrote a lot of pretty good Star Wars books as well. But he wrote the novelization, and he was apparently a big Shadow fan, so he wrote a lot of extra stuff in there to make it more like the pulps. So you get all the extra stuff about the other identity, the Kent Allard identity, and stuff like that. So if you've never read the novelization of the 94 movie and you're a big Shadow fan, you should pick that up. It's super cheap, but there's a couple little things that make it much more like the pulp novels. But again, I've only read 2 of them so far. I would love to pick up all of the republished versions, but I'm having to do them one at a time because it gets kind of pricey, but they're phenomenal. Yes, I still need to finally read Dune, even though I don't know if I'll even like it or not because it's so long. But yeah, that's one of those. It's been on my I need to read list for way too long. So yeah, I need to. Um, yeah. Oh, definitely, Pete. I don't know what the I guess it'll be the same worldwide. I think it's going to be the same in the UK, like similar packaging, same distance stuff. But yeah, if it's the same for you in terms of contents and stuff, it's fantastic. Admittedly not perfect, but the new master I think is phenomenal. I think the color timing, the lighting, contrast, everything is just incredible, and that's the 4K is phenomenal. But even despite the compression issues, I think they finally nailed the presentation in non-HDR on the 1080p versions. Because I was watching through that and I was just amazed at finally all the little things that I had noticed over the years, and even in the old versions where they couldn't get the color exactly right, or and especially all the stuff I didn't like in the full disclosure Blu-ray is fixed. And it's going to be a bit different, you know, if you've never seen a print of Apocalypse, you know, it does look very different in ways. I know a lot of people on the Blu-ray forums right now are complaining about the Playboy Bunny sequence and that their skin tones look different and the lighting looks different. I'm like, yeah, it looks a lot more naturalistic. Like it felt so much more intrinsic to 1979, and all the color tonality, especially because there's a lot of very vivid color tinting throughout the film, whether it's the sort of uh, bluishness to the lighting when they're walking through the jungle right before they run into the tiger, the bluish a light on their faces and the darkness contrasting with the lush green foliage. Um, or you know the yellows and the pinks of all the smoke bombs going off and building this huge clouds of smoke, or you know, the reds of the fires and the orange and red of the napalm explosion, stuff like that. So I think this is without a doubt the best transfer the film's had, the best it's ever looked. It's just unfortunate that the 4K does not have the original audio option, and the Blu-ray theatrical cut and Redux is just way too. I mean, yeah, it is over compressed, but it's not the worst thing in the world. Like it's still better than the full disclosure Blu-ray, if that makes any sense. So while that's a problem, unless you like to sit there and just zoom in or just look for nothing but compression artifacts, um, you'll be fine. It should be better, you know. But yeah, it's fantastic, especially for $20, you know, because just thinking back, like the complete Dossier or DVD, I think was like 25 or 30 when it came out, and then the full disclosure Blu-ray was like 40 something when it came out. So at least price is going down over time. So, um, and Tarantino's Star Trek, everybody wonders how good a Klingon burger tastes. Yeah. Oh man. Yeah, and then it's imagine if Travolta has a cameo, and yeah, it's like, oh man, like this is yeah, I don't know. Like I'm sure he probably came up with some interesting concept because he was known as a script doctor for Hollywood on call throughout the 90s. So and he's well renowned for his screenplays and stuff in the industry. So I'm sure he just came up with an interesting, slightly original out there concept. And then everybody's like, wow, that's great. And so I don't know where it would go from there. But anyway, I think it's winding down for me here tonight. So I want to thank everybody for hanging out and discussing Apocalypse Now, Heart of Darkness, and hopefully this inspires everybody to dig back into the film and especially check out this new 4K UHD package. It is really fantastic, even though it does have some uh, lapses of judgment, shall we say. But for the super low price point, it's fantastic. And also the new Atmos track will give your subwoofer especially a workout. So it's definitely going to go right in there with the short list of discs to test low frequency performance, because it's really intensive. It's so intensive, you just have to give up after a certain point because you cannot get down that low. Usually with equipment that you're going to be working with at home. But anyway, until next time, everybody keep spinning your physical media and enjoying everything from Laserdisc to 4K UHD. And thanks for hanging out. And until next time, have a better one, everybody.